At the most glamorous gala in all of Manhattan, Charlotte Whitmore was publicly abandoned by her fiancé in front of 300 witnesses, not because she had done anything wrong, but because her family was broke. He handed back the ring with a smile. She stood there with nothing, no money, no future, no floor beneath her feet. Then a quiet janitor handed her a cloth and listened. She had no idea she was talking to the most dangerous man in New York. Like and comment your city below so I can see how far this story has traveled. And stay until the very end, because nothing about this is what it seems. The ballroom smelled like old money and fresh lies. Charlotte Whitmore stood near the east wall of the Meridian Grand Hotel's main event floor, holding a champagne flute she hadn't touched in 40 minutes. The liquid inside had gone warm and flat. She hadn't noticed. She was too busy watching Bradley Hayes work the room, watching the way he moved through clusters of wealth like he was born to it, laughing at the right moments, squeezing the right shoulders, angling his jaw just so when someone important glanced his way. 3 years. She had given that man 3 years. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was supposed to be a celebration. Her late father had built the foundation from nothing, a small nonprofit focused on medical assistance for working-class families in the outer boroughs. Tonight was meant to honor his memory, raise money, and mark the official beginning of Charlotte and Bradley's final stretch before the wedding. 6 weeks out. The invitations had already gone to print. Charlotte was wearing the navy dress her mother had altered twice because they couldn't afford a new one. She had done her own hair. She had borrowed the pearl earrings from her college roommate. She had arrived 40 minutes early to make sure everything was in order because, unlike half the people in this room, she had actually worked to be here. Bradley had arrived 20 minutes late with his collar open and his hair still damp, and he had kissed her on the cheek in a way that felt like a formality. She told herself she was imagining things. She was not imagining things. The trouble started just before 9 o'clock, when a man named Gerald Ashford, silver-haired, loud, the kind of old money that announced itself from across a room, pulled Bradley aside near the bar. Charlotte wasn't close enough to hear the conversation. She could only watch Bradley's face go through a series of small changes, a tightening around the eyes, a particular stillness in his jaw, and then something that looked almost like relief, which made no sense at all. Bradley looked across the room and found her. He didn't smile. He started walking toward her, and something in his stride made Charlotte's stomach drop before he had covered half the distance. She set down the champagne flute on a passing tray. Her hands needed to be free. She didn't know why she felt that. She just did. "We should talk," he said when he reached her. "Okay, not here." He touched her elbow and steered her toward an alcove near the east corridor. It was quieter there, removed from the main floor but not entirely private. Several couples stood nearby. A string quartet was visible through an archway. The sound of conversation and silver against crystal created a soft, relentless noise that suddenly felt oppressive. "Bradley, what's wrong?" He exhaled, looked at the floor, looked back up, and Charlotte saw in his eyes the particular expression of a man who had already made his decision and was now simply managing the logistics of delivering it. "I've been thinking," he said, "about us, about the future. 6 weeks before the wedding. I know the timing is Bradley. Charlotte." He said her name like a period. "Final. Your family's financial situation has gotten worse, significantly worse. Gerald just confirmed it with 2 other investors who were approached about the debt restructuring. Your mother's second mortgage, the medical liens still attached to the estate, it's more than I understood when we got engaged." She stared at him. "You're talking about money. I'm talking about our future. Those are 2 different things." "Not always." He had the decency to look uncomfortable, but not enough decency to stop. "I have responsibilities. My firm's reputation, my family's expectations. I can't walk into a marriage with that kind of financial liability attached. It's not personal, it's don't." Her voice dropped low. "Don't you dare say it's not personal." "I'm sorry." "You're sorry." She laughed, and it came out wrong, sharp and brittle. "You're ending our engagement 6 weeks before our wedding because my family has debt, and you're sorry." "Your family is drowning, Charlotte." He said it quietly, like that made it gentler. "I'm not tying my future to a sinking ship." She heard it land, felt it. The words moved through her chest like something being extracted without anesthesia. She was aware, in a distant and horrible way, that two couples nearby had gone quiet, that a woman in a red dress was pretending to check her phone while watching from 7 feet away, that the string quartet had shifted into something slow and minor key, which was deeply unkind timing. Charlotte did not cry. She would not cry in this room, in this dress, in front of these people. She held Bradley's gaze for 3 full seconds. She wanted him to understand, not that she was hurt, but that she saw him, the real him, the man beneath the tailored jacket and the practiced ease, the man who had just weighed her worth against a spreadsheet and come up short. "Give me the ring," she said. "Charlotte, the ring, Bradley." He reached into his jacket pocket. He had been carrying it. He had brought it tonight, already removed from her finger in his mind, already returned. She hadn't even noticed it was gone until this moment, and that fact alone, that she had spent the evening ringless and hadn't felt the absence, told her something about how numb she had already become to this relationship. She took the ring, looked at it once, set it on the nearby ledge beside an untouched glass of water. Then she walked away from him. She walked through the ballroom with her spine straight and her face composed, and she did not look at the red dress woman or the quiet couples or Gerald Ashford, who was watching from the bar with an expression that might have been sympathy but was probably just curiosity. She walked through the main doors and into the marble corridor outside, and she kept walking until she turned a corner and found herself alone in a stretch of hallway that led to the hotel's service wing. Then she stopped, pressed her back against the cool marble, and fell apart. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't movie crying. It was the kind of breaking that happens quietly. Her shoulders going inward, her breath catching in a pattern that wasn't quite sobbing but wasn't breathing either, her hands coming up to cover her face not for anyone else's benefit, but because she needed something to press against. The weight behind her eyes was immense. 3 years, the wedding invitations, the altered navy dress, her dead father's foundation, which was now 2 missed payments away from having its accounts frozen because Charlotte had quietly redirected her personal savings to cover operational costs rather than let his legacy fold. Her father had died 14 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and brutal. The medical bills had arrived before they'd finished planning the funeral. Her mother had remortgaged the house. Charlotte had liquidated her retirement account. And still it wasn't enough because the American healthcare system had a particular talent for turning grief into arithmetic. She had not told Bradley how bad it really was. She had told herself she was protecting him from worry. In truth, she had been protecting herself from exactly this conversation, from seeing his face when he learned the number, from confirming what she had suspected for months, that his affection for her had limits, and those limits were financial. Now she knew. She pressed her palms flat against the marble and focused on breathing. "That floor's going to leave a mark on your dress." The voice was quiet, not startling, more like it had always been there, and she was only now hearing it. Charlotte opened her eyes. A man was pushing a mop across the corridor floor, maybe 15 feet away. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing the gray uniform of the hotel's maintenance staff. His hair was dark and slightly overgrown, like he'd missed a haircut by a couple of weeks. He wasn't looking at her directly. His eyes were on the floor, and the mop was moving in slow, even strokes. "Sorry?" she managed. "Your dress." He nodded slightly in her direction without stopping his work. "You're leaning against marble. The trim's going to pick up residue if you stay like that." Charlotte looked down, stepped away from the wall. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out raw and she hated it. The man reached into the pocket of his work vest and produced a folded cloth, clean, pressed, the kind the hotel staff used for quick surface wipes. He held it out without drama, without pity, without the particular look of someone performing kindness for an audience. She crossed the distance and took it. "Long night?" he asked, still not looking at her fully, still moving the mop. "Getting longer," she said. He made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite acknowledgement, something in between that managed to communicate that he'd heard her without requiring her to perform anything more. Charlotte pressed the cloth against the corners of her eyes, breathed. The hallway was cool and empty and smelled like marble dust and the faint chemical of cleaning solution, and it was the most comfortable she had felt all evening. "I just got my engagement ended," she said. She didn't know why she said it. Maybe because he was a stranger. Maybe because the marble corridor was its own kind of confession booth. Maybe because he wasn't looking at her with that look, the one that was already calculating how to use her vulnerability. Sounds like it needed to be. She looked at him. You don't know anything about it. No, he agreed. He stopped mopping for a moment and leaned slightly on the handle, and for the first time she got a proper look at his face. Strong jaw. A thin scar along the left cheekbone, old and faded. Eyes that were a particular shade of blue, not vivid, not striking, just deep in the way that still water is deep. But somebody who ends an engagement in a ballroom full of people usually isn't someone who should have been engaged to begin with. Charlotte opened her mouth, closed it. He said my family has too much debt, she said, that I'm a sinking ship. The man looked at her steadily. Then he's an idiot. He's not an idiot, he's practical. Being practical about the wrong things is its own kind of stupidity. She stared at him. He picked up the mop again and resumed working. Charlotte found herself standing in the middle of the service corridor of the Meridian Grand Hotel in her borrowed pearls and her altered dress, holding a maintenance cloth. And for a strange, suspended moment, she felt more seen by this quiet man with a mop than she had felt in 3 years with Bradley Hayes. I'm Charlotte, she said. He glanced at her. Roman. Do you work here often? Every Thursday. He paused. Sometimes Fridays. Is it terrible? He thought about it for a moment, actually thought about it, which wasn't what she'd expected. No, he said finally. People ignore you. You learn a lot about a place when people think you're invisible. Charlotte nodded slowly. She didn't know what to do with that. A door at the far end of the corridor swung open and a hotel manager appeared, scanning the hallway. His eyes landed on Charlotte and his expression shifted into the professional concern of someone who handled difficult guests for a living. Ms. Whitmore, your presence has been requested back in the main hall. The tribute speech is scheduled in about 10 minutes. She looked at the manager. Then she looked back at Roman, who had already turned away and was moving down the corridor with his mop, steady and unhurried, like a tide going out. Thank you, she said to his back. He didn't turn around, but she saw his head incline slightly, the smallest of acknowledgments, and then he rounded the corner and was gone. Charlotte straightened her spine, smoothed the front of her dress, and followed the manager back toward the noise and the lights, and the night that still had another 2 hours left in it. She gave the tribute speech. She did not cry. She drove herself home at midnight in a car that needed new brake pads, to an apartment whose lease renewal she wasn't sure she could afford, and she sat on her kitchen floor with her back against the refrigerator because the chair felt like too much effort, and she thought about a quiet man in a gray uniform who had called Bradley Hayes an idiot. It was, she realized, the kindest thing anyone had said to her in months. The next 2 weeks were the kind that leave marks. Charlotte worked 12-hour days at Hargrove and Associates, where she was employed as a financial consultant specializing in forensic accounting, the unglamorous, necessary work of untangling corporate numbers that didn't add up. She was good at it, methodical, patient, capable of holding complex systems in her head and finding the single thread that, when pulled, unraveled everything. Her supervisor, a rigid man named Dennis Falk, had once told her she thought like a machine, which he'd meant as a compliment and she'd received as a warning about what she was becoming. At home, the numbers were less abstract and considerably more personal. She had constructed the spreadsheet in the first week after her father died, and she had updated it every Sunday since with a discipline that was almost punishing. Medical liens, $214,000, reduced from $251,000 through a payment plan that was currently 3 months behind. Her mother's second mortgage, $118,000. The foundation's operational deficit for the current fiscal year, $34,000 and climbing. Her own credit card debt, accumulated across 18 months of quietly subsidizing the above, $28,500. Total liability, not counting compound interest, $394,500. Total liquid assets, $6,200. She looked at that bottom line on a Tuesday night and felt something very close to nothing, which was perhaps the most frightening thing she had ever felt. The loan rejections came in various forms: standardized emails, brief phone calls, one in-person meeting with a lending officer at a regional bank who had looked at her debt-to-income ratio and given her an expression that managed to be both apologetic and final at the same time. She had 4 weeks before the foundation's bank would freeze the operating account. She had 6 weeks before her mother's house went into formal default proceedings. She did not sleep well. On a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week, she was eating toast over the sink, a habit she'd developed to avoid having to wash a plate, when her phone rang, an unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. Something made her answer. Ms. Whitmore. The voice on the other end was measured, careful, male, and neither young nor old. My name is Thomas Crane. I'm calling on behalf of a client who has made a request that I've been asked to relay to you directly. What kind of request? A pause. The kind that's easier to discuss in person. Are you available this evening? She should have said no. She should have asked more questions. She stood in her kitchen in yesterday's socks with toast crumbs on her shirt and thought about the spreadsheet and said, "What time?" They met at a restaurant in Midtown. Quiet, expensive. The kind of place where conversations didn't carry between tables by design. Thomas Crane was a slender man in his late 50s wearing a suit that had been made specifically for him. He had the careful posture of someone who had spent his career as an intermediary, and he spoke with a precision that suggested each word had been selected and placed with deliberate intention. My client, he said, became aware of your situation through channels I'm not at liberty to specify. He is not a creditor, not a competitor, and not connected to any of the individuals currently holding your family's debt. His interest is entirely his own. What does he want? Crane folded his hands on the table. He is proposing a contract arrangement, a marriage. Charlotte set down her water glass. I'm sorry? A legal marriage. 2 years in duration. At the end of that period, an uncontested divorce by mutual agreement. In exchange for your participation, my client will clear all outstanding debt associated with both you and your family, including the medical liens, the secondary mortgage, and your personal liabilities. He will provide stable housing in Manhattan for the duration of the arrangement. He will also establish a 6-month operational fund for the Whitmore Foundation. She stared at him. This is a real conversation you're having with me right now, she said. It is. Who is your client? He prefers to introduce himself personally, if you're amenable to proceeding. I'm not amenable to anything until I know who I'm supposedly marrying. Another pause. Crane reached into his jacket and placed a business card on the table. It had a name on it. Just a name. No title. No company. No address. Black ink on cream stock. Roman DeLuca. Charlotte looked at the card for a long time. The janitor, she said. My client is more than his employment at the Meridian, Crane said carefully. He's a janitor who wants to pay off $400,000 in debt in exchange for a 2-year marriage to a woman he met in a hotel corridor. That is a simplified description of the arrangement, yes. Why? Crane met her eyes. That is a question he's asked to answer himself. She picked up the card, turned it over. The back was blank. She thought about the spreadsheet. She thought about her mother, who had started working double shifts at the school cafeteria and wasn't sleeping either. She thought about her father's foundation and what he had built and why he had built it and what it would mean for it to fold because Charlotte couldn't hold the numbers together. She thought about a quiet man with still-water eyes who had handed her a cloth and said nothing that wasn't true. Tell him I'll meet him, she said. Roman DeLuca lived in an apartment on the 4th floor of a building in Alphabet City that was clean and functional and utterly without distinction. The kind of place that existed to be lived in rather than noticed. He answered the door in dark jeans and a gray thermal shirt, and he looked exactly as she remembered him. Composed, unhurried, that quality of stillness that wasn't passivity, but something closer to conservation. You came, he said. You sent Thomas Crane to offer me a deal that sounds like a fever dream, she said. So yes, I came. He stepped back and let her in. The apartment was spare, books on 2 shelves organized by size, a kitchen that was cleaner than hers, a dining table with 4 chairs, none of which matched, no photographs on the walls, no obvious personal artifacts of any kind. He gestured to the table. She sat. He sat across from her. He poured coffee from a press without asking if she wanted any, and she discovered she did. Why? She said, skipping everything else. Because I need to be married, he said. Temporarily, for reasons I'm not going to explain in full tonight. That's not good enough. I know. He looked at her steadily. I'm not asking you to trust me completely. I'm asking you to consider a contract, Everything Thomas outlined is guaranteed. The legal agreements are already drafted. Your attorney can review them. I'd expect no less. The terms don't require anything from you except your name on a marriage certificate and a reasonable standard of public conduct while the arrangement is active. Public conduct, she repeated. Meaning what? Meaning if we attend events together, we behave as a married couple. Nothing beyond what you're comfortable with. The arrangement is a business agreement. I'm not asking for anything personal. She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. It was good coffee, dark and precise. You're a janitor, she said. Where does $400,000 come from? Something crossed his face. Not discomfort, more like a decision being made about how much to reveal. I have savings from previous employment. What previous employment? Work I no longer do. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The kitchen clock ticked. Is this legal? She asked. The contract? Completely. And everything connected to you, the money, the arrangement, the reasons you need a temporary wife, is all of that legal? A pause. The marriage is legal. The financial transfers are legal. My background is more complicated than my current employment suggests, but nothing I'm asking you to participate in will put you at risk. That's not a full answer. It's the answer I can give you tonight. Charlotte breathed out slowly. She thought about $400,000. She thought about her mother's hands, cracked from the cafeteria work, and how she'd pretended not to notice when Charlotte visited last weekend. She thought about what her father had said once, near the end, when the morphine was making him philosophical, that the worst kind of pride was the kind that let people you loved suffer rather than ask for help. I want a lawyer to review everything before I sign anything, she said. Of course. I want the foundation fund established before the courthouse date, not after. Roman nodded. Reasonable. And I want to be able to leave. If something feels wrong, if I feel unsafe or deceived in any material way, I want a clause that lets me exit without financial penalty. He studied her. There was something in his expression that might have been respect. Done, he said. You'll agree to that without negotiating? I'm not interested in negotiating terms that would trap you, he said simply. That's not what this is. She sat with that. What is it then? A practical solution, he said, for two people with problems that don't overlap but can be resolved simultaneously. What's your problem? His jaw moved slightly. I need to demonstrate a stable personal life. Specific circumstances require it. I can't be more specific than that right now. That's remarkably vague for someone proposing marriage. It is, he agreed. I'm sorry for that. I know it's not enough. He said the words without performance, without the particular inflection of someone trying to move her toward a predetermined conclusion. He said it like a fact, that he knew it wasn't enough, and that knowing it didn't change what he was able to offer. Charlotte set down the mug. Send the documents to my attorney, she said. Her name is Patricia Eng. I'll have her contact information to Thomas Crane by tomorrow morning. Something shifted in Roman's eyes. Just slightly. Not relief exactly, more like a calibration. All right, he said. She stood up. He stood with her. That automatic, old-fashioned courtesy that she noticed every time and couldn't quite categorize. She moved toward the door and then stopped. At the hotel, she said, that night. You had no idea who I was. It wasn't a question, but he answered it. No, he said. I didn't. But you found out later, before you sent Crane. Yes. So you looked me up. Yes. She turned to face him. Why? Out of all the crying women in hotel corridors you probably walk past, why me? Roman was quiet for a moment. His eyes were on her and they were serious, and when he spoke she had the distinct sense that he was saying something he hadn't planned to say. Because you didn't perform it, he said. Perform what? The grief. The humiliation. Most people, when they're hurt in public, they manage the presentation. They make sure the hurt looks a certain way so other people respond correctly. He paused. You weren't doing that. You were just in it, without trying to shape it. Charlotte stared at him. That's a very specific thing to notice about a stranger, she said. I notice specific things, he said. She held his gaze for another moment and then nodded once. I'll have Patricia contact Thomas by morning. She left the apartment and walked down the 4 flights and out into the Alphabet City street, where the October air was cold and smelled like exhaust and the distant river. And she stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her hands in her coat pockets. She had just agreed to consider marrying a man she didn't know for reasons he couldn't explain with money he couldn't fully account for. And the most alarming part of the entire evening was that it had felt more honest than most conversations she'd had in the last 3 years. Patricia Ng reviewed the documents and called Charlotte the following Tuesday morning. "This is the most legally airtight contract arrangement I have ever seen," Patricia said. "Whoever drafted this used attorneys that charge more per hour than I make in a week. The exit clause you requested is in there, worded exactly as you specified. The foundation fund is established in escrow pending signature. Every financial transfer has been structured through mechanisms that are entirely above board." A pause. "Charlotte, where did you find this person?" "He was mopping a floor." Silence. "Right, I'm going to need more context at some point, but for now, legally, this is clean. Whether it's wise is a different category of question." "I know. Do you want to do it?" Charlotte looked at the spreadsheet open on her laptop. She looked at it for a long time. "Yes," she said. The courthouse wedding was on a Thursday morning, which felt appropriately unremarkable. Charlotte wore dark slacks and a cream blouse and her own pearl earrings this time, bought secondhand from a shop in Brooklyn. Thomas Crane served as witness. There was a second witness Charlotte didn't recognize, but a large, quiet man with close-cropped gray hair who stood near the exit and watched the proceedings with an expression that revealed absolutely nothing. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Roman signed his name with the same quality she was beginning to identify as characteristic. Deliberate, unhurried, like each action was complete in itself. He slid the simple gold band onto her finger, and his hands were warm and steady, and she noticed, because she noticed things now, that he didn't look away from her face the way people sometimes did during ceremonial moments when the weight of the occasion felt unnatural. He looked at her directly. She looked back. "That's it," the clerk said cheerfully. That was it. They went to a diner afterward because Roman suggested it and Charlotte didn't have a better idea, and they sat across from each other in a booth with sticky menus and ordered eggs and coffee and ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which itself felt like something worth noting. "The moving truck will be available Saturday morning," Roman said. "Thomas has the address of the apartment." "Is it your apartment?" "It will be ours. For 2 years." She nodded, ate her eggs. "Ground rules," she said. "Go ahead." "I work long hours. I'll be in the office before 7 most mornings. I come home when the work is done, not at a set time." "Fine." "I don't cook. I mean, I can, but I won't be doing it regularly." "I cook," he said. "It's not a problem." She looked at him. "You cook." "Yes." "The janitor cooks." Something that might have been humor moved across his face, very briefly. "The janitor cooks." She returned to her eggs. "I have a friend named Dana who calls me every Sunday evening. We talk for at least an hour. She asks a lot of questions. I'm going to tell her this marriage is real and that I genuinely wanted it." "Okay." "You can't contradict that if you meet her." "I won't. And if I have a bad day, I'm not going to explain myself. I'm going to be in a mood, and you're going to leave me alone about it." Roman set down his coffee. "Charlotte." "What?" "I'm not Bradley." She held very still. "I know that," she said. "I just want to make sure the ground rules account for it." She looked at him across the sticky table with his cool coffee and his steady eyes and his face that gave away almost nothing, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was clenched. "Noted," she said. The apartment was on the 11th floor of a building on the Upper West Side, and it was significantly larger than anything Roman's janitor salary should have been able to sustain. Charlotte noticed this and filed it away without comment, because she had noticed a great many things since agreeing to this arrangement, and she was developing a particular discipline around choosing when to ask questions versus when to simply observe. The living space was open and quiet with high ceilings. Roman had already arranged his belongings in a way that left half the space deliberately unoccupied, a clearing, an invitation for her things to arrive. It was a small detail, and it meant something, and she was beginning to understand that with this man, small details were usually the things that meant something. She set up her home office in the second bedroom. She arranged her books the way she preferred them. She put her coffee maker in a specific location on the kitchen counter, and he moved his own coffee equipment to accommodate it without being asked, which she discovered Monday morning when she came into the kitchen for the first time and found the counter reorganized. Life adjusted to the shape of the arrangement. She left early and came home late. He was often there when she arrived, not waiting for her exactly, but present, and the apartment always smelled of whatever he'd been cooking, and there was always enough. He didn't ask about her day unless she volunteered it. She didn't ask about his unless he mentioned it. They developed a rhythm that was respectful and careful and gradually less formal. She noticed things. He read constantly. Dense books. History, economics, the occasional novel in what she was fairly certain was Italian. He left them on the coffee table and never marked the pages and always seemed to know exactly where he'd stopped. He ran in the mornings before she woke up, and sometimes when she was up early for a call, she'd see him coming back down the street from the window, breathing even, covering distance like a man with somewhere to be and no urgency to reach it. He received phone calls. The phone calls were the first sustained anomaly she allowed herself to catalog. They came at irregular intervals, often in the evenings, and they never lasted long. He took them in the hallway or occasionally in his bedroom with the door closed, and when he returned, his expression was composed in the same way it always was, which she was starting to understand as a practiced quality rather than a natural one. There was a difference between a face that didn't show things and a face that had learned not to show things. Roman had the second kind. She also noticed the men. There were two of them, and they were not consistent. They rotated, 3 or 4 of them in total, but there were always two. One near the building entrance when she left in the morning. One in a car parked along the block when she came home at night. She noticed them the first week and confirmed her suspicion over the second week by varying her arrival times and entry points, and they adjusted accordingly. Security detail. She sat with that for a full week before saying anything. It was a Sunday evening in November, just past 9, and she was at the kitchen table with her laptop, and he was at the counter making something with garlic and wine, and she said without preamble, "The men outside. They're watching me too, aren't they? Not just you?" Roman's hand stopped moving for exactly 1 second. "Yes," he said. "Why do you need a security detail?" "There are people who are angry with me," he said, "for my previous employment. The men outside are a precaution." "What kind of previous employment requires that kind of precaution?" He turned from the counter. His face was measured and careful, and she could see him choosing not what to say, but how much. "Charlotte," he said, "I told you the arrangement was legal. I told you nothing I'm asking you to participate in would put you at risk. Those things are still true. But there are aspects of my life I can't explain fully right now." He held her gaze. "I know that's not enough. You said that before. It's still true." She looked at him across the kitchen, and she thought about the exit clause Patricia had built into the contract, and she thought about the foundation account and her mother and the building's high ceilings, and she thought about his hand stopping for exactly 1 second. "Fine," she said, "but at some point you're going to tell me." "Yes," he said. "I mean it." "I know you do." She looked back at her laptop. He turned back to the counter. The wine hissed when it hit the hot pan. The weeks turned into something else. Somewhere in the geography between November and January, without any single moment she could have pointed to as the cause, the careful distance began to compress. Not from any particular action, but from the accumulation of ordinary proximity, of mornings in the same kitchen, of evenings when neither of them wanted to retreat to separate rooms, of conversations that started practical and then ran past their natural stopping points. She learned that he'd grown up in New York, that he had a complicated relationship with his family that he described only in the gaps of what he didn't say, that he spoke 4 languages and played chess with a precision that was borderline unsettling, that he had an opinion about coffee that was more developed than most people had about things they actually cared about, that he read the newspaper in physical form every morning and had opinions about the city that were simultaneously cynical and deeply invested. He learned that she'd grown up in New Jersey, that she'd chosen forensic accounting because she'd watched her family be taken advantage of financially and wanted to understand the mechanism, that she had a talent for silence that most people misread as coldness, that she made bad decisions when she was tired and knew it and did it anyway, that she missed her father every morning, specifically every morning, the way some losses work. One night in February, she came home at 11:30 from a client situation that had gone badly, and she sat down on the couch, still in her coat, and she was too tired to construct any form of composure. Roman came out of the kitchen, read the situation in approximately 2 seconds, and disappeared. He came back with a mug of something warm that wasn't coffee and set it on the table in front of her. Then he sat at the other end of the couch and opened his book and said nothing. She sat there in her coat for 20 minutes. At some point, the warmth of the apartment and the weight of the day and the small, ordinary kindness of him just sitting there without requiring anything of her reached a certain threshold, and she thought, oh, she was in trouble. Not the financial kind. The other kind. The kind that doesn't come with a spreadsheet or an exit clause. The kind that makes a practical arrangement into a very different problem. She did not sleep well that night. March arrived cold and direct. Charlotte was handling a complicated case. A mid-sized manufacturing company, whose books had been altered across 3 fiscal years, and the alterations were subtle enough that she was spending 60-hour weeks unpacking them. She was deep in a spreadsheet on a Thursday evening when her phone lit up with a message from Dana. Charlotte, call me. Something I need to tell you before tomorrow night. Tomorrow night was the Ashford Foundation Gala. Bradley Hayes' family foundation. They had received an invitation that had been sent before the divorce announcement and which Charlotte had been planning to skip, but Roman had mentioned carefully that his presence at certain events was useful, and the Ashford Gala was the kind of event where a particular kind of impression mattered. She called Dana. Bradley is bringing someone, Dana said, without warm-up. He's been seeing her since October. She's being introduced officially tomorrow. Her name is Kendall Marsh, and her family's worth about $300 million, and I wanted you to hear it from me instead of in a room full of people watching your face. Charlotte absorbed this. Okay, she said. Are you okay? I'm working through 4 years of accounting fraud, Dana. I have limited capacity for feelings right now. Charlotte. I'm fine. She meant it, mostly. What she felt was something more complicated than grief. Something that looked more like retrospective relief and also, under it, a specific kind of tiredness at how thoroughly she had underestimated what she was worth. I'll see you tomorrow. She hung up and looked at her screen for a while. Then she got up and found Roman in the living room, and she told him what Dana had said, and he listened without expression, and she said, I want to go to the gala tomorrow, and I want to go with you. And I want it to be very clear to everyone in that room that I am not a sinking ship. Roman looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. The Ashford Foundation Gala was held at a venue on Park Avenue that was slightly less grand than the Meridian, but considerably more exclusive. The crowd was older money, more restrained, the kind of room where status was communicated through understatement. Charlotte wore a dress she had purchased specifically, the first significant thing she had bought for herself in 2 years, and she was aware as they entered that she looked different than she had at the Whitmore Gala. Not more expensive, exactly, but more certain. Like she had stopped apologizing with her posture. Roman wore dark charcoal, and he was clean and controlled, and he moved through the room like water, unhurried, frictionless, taking up exactly the space he was entitled to and no more. People noticed him. That was the first thing she registered. People kept noticing Roman in ways that she would have described, if asked, as not quite recognition, but something adjacent to it. The particular attention of people who couldn't quite place a face, but felt, at some level, that they should. She saw Bradley across the room within the first 20 minutes. He was with a tall, expensively dressed woman who had the particular ease of someone who had never had to count anything. He saw Charlotte. She watched him process the sight of her. Healthy, unhurried, standing next to a man whose bearing, if you looked closely enough, was not the bearing of someone accustomed to service corridors. They made their way around the room. A woman named Victoria Kensington intercepted them near the bar. Victoria Kensington was the kind of socialite who treated cruelty as a form of entertainment, who had the particular talent for inflicting damage with a smile that gave the damaged person nowhere to stand. She was in her 40s, immaculate, and had the social awareness to know that Charlotte was vulnerable and the inclination to test it. Charlotte Whitmore, Victoria said, with the warm inflection of someone who was not warm. I didn't expect to see you here. I heard about the engagement. I was so sorry. She let the sympathy sit for exactly long enough to become its opposite. And this must be your... Her eyes moved to Roman, assessed, catalogued. The uniform was gone. He was in charcoal and his jaw was set and his eyes were steady. But Victoria Kensington had spent 30 years reading rooms, and she placed him where she thought he belonged. Your husband. I heard something about a courthouse situation. Darling, a janitor. You settled, Charlotte. After everything, you settled for a man with a mop. The people nearby went quiet. Charlotte felt the room align against her. That familiar weight. She thought about the Whitmore Gala. She thought about standing in the corridor with her back against the marble. She was about to speak when the main doors of the ballroom opened. A man entered, tall, silver-haired, with the controlled pacing of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around him. He was the hotel's owner. Not this hotel, but a man whose name was on 3 buildings visible from this address. He moved through the crowd without pausing for senators or CEOs or the 2 celebrities near the window. He walked directly to Roman. He stopped and lowered his head. Not a nod, not an acknowledgement. A lowering of the head, brief and complete, the kind that was not social courtesy, but something older and more specific. Boss, he said, his voice carrying just far enough. The family council is waiting. We've delayed the meeting as long as we can manage. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes understanding. Charlotte watched Roman's face, which had changed in no measurable way, and then she watched Victoria Kensington's face, which had changed considerably, and then she watched the room around her as people reached into pockets for phones and entered a name and a face into search bars. Roman Moretti. The name moved across the room like a current. She didn't know the name. She would look it up later, like everyone else, and she would read the same fragments. The disappeared patriarch of the Moretti organization, one of the most powerful criminal networks operating behind legitimate corporate structures in the northeastern United States, who had vanished from public knowledge roughly 4 years ago and had not been photographed or documented since, who had left a power vacuum that had apparently not been entirely filled. She knew none of this yet. What she knew in this moment was that the man standing next to her, the man who made coffee with precision and ran in the mornings and had handed her a maintenance cloth in a hotel corridor and called Bradley Hayes an idiot and cooked with garlic and wine and sat at the other end of the couch and required nothing of her, was not who she had believed him to be. She turned to look at him. His eyes found hers, and in them, beneath the composure, beneath the control that she now understood as something practiced over years of necessity, she saw the one thing she had not expected to see. He had known this moment was coming. He had been waiting for it. And whatever he was bracing for, it was not the crowd. It was her. Charlotte did not say anything. She looked at him for 3 full seconds, and then she turned, and she walked through the silent ballroom toward the exit, and the crowd parted without her asking, and she pushed through the main doors and out into the cold March air. Behind her, she heard nothing. The door swung closed on a room full of people holding the name Roman Moretti on their phones, and somewhere inside, the man she had married was standing in the silence she had left behind. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold, and the city moved around her completely indifferent to the fact that everything had just changed. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Let me explain, please." She put the phone in her pocket. She did not respond. She started walking. She walked 6 blocks before she stopped. Not because she had somewhere to go, not because she'd made a decision. She stopped because her legs registered what her mind hadn't yet processed, that she was in heels on a March sidewalk in a city that didn't care, moving away from something without moving toward anything, and at some point that became its own kind of problem. She stood at the corner of Park and 61st and let the cold work on her face. Around her, the city moved with its usual indifference. Cabs, a couple arguing in a doorway, a man walking a dog that was trying to eat something off the sidewalk. The ordinary machinery of New York at 9:30 on a weeknight, completely uninterested in the fact that Charlotte Whitmore had just discovered she was married to a man whose name people looked up with the expression they reserved for things they'd read about but never expected to encounter in a ballroom. She pulled out her phone. The text was still there. "Let me explain, please." She read it 3 times, then she opened a browser and typed Roman Moretti into the search bar. The results came back immediately. She stood on the corner with her coat pulled tight and read. Not everything. There was too much, fragments and references and pieces of a story that had been assembled from public records and court documents and journalism that was carefully worded in the way journalism was carefully worded when the subject had lawyers who were very good at their jobs. But enough. The Moretti Organization. A name that had existed in the architecture of New York's criminal infrastructure for 3 generations before it disappeared from active public record approximately 4 years ago when Roman Moretti, the 3rd-generation head, had vanished from every verifiable context. No arrest, no public statement, no paper trail beyond the legitimate holding companies that continued to operate under management that was technically on record but practically a facade. He hadn't gone anywhere. He'd gone invisible. She put the phone back in her pocket. The text sat there unanswered. She got in a cab. She didn't go home. She went to Dana's apartment on the west side, and Dana opened the door in pajamas with the specific expression of someone who had been monitoring the situation from a distance via text and was prepared for a range of outcomes. She didn't ask questions. She let Charlotte in, poured 2 glasses of something, and sat across from her on the couch, in the way that only people who have known each other for 15 years can sit. Without ceremony, without the need to establish emotional tone. "Tell me," Dana said. Charlotte told her. Not everything, but enough. The contract, the courthouse, the arrangement, the months of careful ordinariness. And then tonight, the man in the doorway lowering his head, the name traveling across the ballroom on phone screens, the look on Roman's face when he'd found hers in the crowd. He had known. That was the thing she kept returning to. He had known that moment was coming. He had built the entire arrangement knowing that at some point the floor would give way, and he had let her walk into it anyway. Dana was quiet for a moment. "Are you in danger?" she asked. "I don't think so." "That's not a no." "No," Charlotte said. "I don't think I'm in danger. I think I've been lied to by omission for 5 months by a man who is considerably more complicated than a Thursday janitor." "Charlotte," Dana set down her glass. "You married him." "I know." "Like legally. He's your husband." "I know that, Dana. And you had no idea." "I had—" She stopped. Thought about the security detail, the phone calls taken in the hallway, the books in Italian, the quality of stillness that she'd identified as practiced rather than natural. "I had pieces," she said. "I chose not to assemble them." "Why?" She looked at her glass. "Because I didn't want to." Dana absorbed that without judgment, which was one of the things Charlotte had always loved about her. "What are you going to do?" Dana asked. "I don't know yet." "Are you going back to the apartment?" Charlotte thought about the apartment, the kitchen that smelled like garlic and wine, the coffee maker position she'd established, the books on the table, the couch where he'd sat at the other end without requiring anything. "Yes," she said, "eventually." She slept on Dana's pullout and lay awake for most of it. She was back at the apartment by 7 in the morning. Roman was in the kitchen. He heard her come in and turned from the counter, and his face was composed in that particular way, but under it something else, a tension around the jaw that she'd never seen before, or maybe had seen and misread. He didn't speak first. Neither did she for a moment. She set her bag down and took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door, all the ordinary actions of coming home. And then she turned and looked at him. "Roman Moretti," she said. "Yes, not Roman DeLuca. DeLuca was my mother's name. It's legal. I've used it for 4 years. While you were hiding. While I was managing a transition." He said it carefully. Hiding implies I was afraid. I wasn't afraid. I was strategic. "There's a difference?" "Yes." She walked to the kitchen table and sat down. He stayed at the counter. "Tell me what you couldn't tell me before," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he moved to the table and sat across from her, and she had the sense of watching him make a decision about architecture, about how much structure to reveal versus how much to keep standing. 3 generations ago," he said, "my grandfather built an organization in New York. The way those organizations were built in that era, through relationships, through enforcement, through money that moved in ways that weren't always traceable. By the time it reached my father, it had legitimate infrastructure, holdings companies, property, investments. The illegal elements were reduced, not eliminated, reduced. And when it reached you, when it reached me, I was 26, and I wasn't ready. And I made the mistake of trying to change things too quickly. He looked at his hands. There were people inside the organization who didn't want change, who had built significant personal wealth on specific operations I was trying to close. 4 years ago, they moved against me, internally, a vote within the family council to remove me from leadership. A coup, a vote. The distinction matters because it determines what happens next. You can't fight a coup with lawyers. A vote, a fraudulent vote, you can fight if you survive long enough to gather evidence. Charlotte looked at him. You went underground. I reduced my exposure, continued operating the legitimate entities through proxies. Monitored the situation. A pause. Waited. For what? For them to make enough mistakes in writing. She let that sit. And the janitor job? Something moved in his face, not quite what she would have called embarrassment, but adjacent. I needed somewhere to be, he said. I needed ordinary context, and I needed... He stopped. What? He looked at her directly. I needed to know if I was still a person, outside of all of it, without the name and the organization and the infrastructure, whether there was anything left that wasn't constructed. She stared at him. That's why you were mopping floors, she said. An identity crisis. A more dangerous version of one, yes. And me. Her voice came out flatter than she intended. Where do I fit in that? The contract marriage to a woman you met crying in a hotel corridor. What was that? The council vote is in 6 weeks, he said. The people who moved against me 4 years ago have been consolidating. They've been able to argue internally that I'm destabilized, that I'm compromised, that someone without ties, without a stable foundation, can't lead a complex organization. He paused. A married man with a life has standing they can't easily dismiss. You needed a prop. I needed a wife. Those are the same thing. They're not, he said, and there was something sharp in it, the first sharp thing she'd heard from him. I chose you specifically, Charlotte, not because you were convenient, because I'd watched you in a corridor for 20 minutes and you were honest, in a way that most people in my life have never been. I thought... He stopped himself. You thought what? His jaw tightened. I thought that if I was going to ask someone to live in proximity to my life, I wanted it to be someone who wouldn't perform it. She remembered saying that to her, the night in his apartment, because you didn't perform it. She stood up. You watched me have a breakdown, she said, in a hotel corridor, and you decided that made me useful. That's not... You identified my financial situation. You identified my vulnerability. You designed a proposal that I couldn't practically refuse, and you sent a lawyer to my door. And at no point in 5 months did you tell me who you were or what I was actually part of. The contract was clean. I told you. The contract. She laughed, but it came out wrong. Yes, the contract was clean. The exit clause was there. You were very careful about the legal architecture, Roman. Very careful. But you didn't tell me I was living in the middle of a criminal succession war with a security detail outside my building that I had to figure out myself. You weren't in danger. That is not the point. Her voice cracked on the last word and she hated it, hated that the crack was there, but she didn't look away from him. The point is that I made a decision based on information you controlled. You let me believe I understood what I was in. I didn't. And you knew that. Every day for 5 months you knew that. And you made coffee, and you read your books, and you sat on the couch, and you said nothing. Roman was very still. Yes, he said. Yes. Yes, he said again. You're right. She picked up her bag. I'm going to work, she said. Charlotte, I'm going to work, Roman. I need to think, and I can't do it here. She was at the door when he said, The council vote is in 6 weeks. If you invoke the exit clause now, it affects the standing of the case we've been building. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I'm also not asking you to stay for that reason. She stopped. Then what are you asking? He was quiet for a moment. I'm asking you not to make a decision tonight. She stood at the door with her hand on the frame. I'm not making a decision tonight, she said. I'm going to work. She left. The morning was cold and gray, and she walked 3 blocks to the subway instead of taking a cab because she needed the air and the movement. And on the train, she stood and held the overhead rail and stared at the black window across from her, where her own reflection floated and didn't quite look like herself. She thought about the spreadsheet. She thought about the exit clause. She thought about the 6 weeks before a vote that determined whether the man she'd married remained in control of an organization that she was only now beginning to understand the dimensions of. She thought about the way he'd said, "I thought that if I was going to ask someone to live in proximity to my life, I wanted it to be someone who wouldn't perform it." She hated that it landed. She hated that even now, knowing everything she knew, it landed. The day was 12 hours of forensic spreadsheets, and she was grateful for it. She didn't go home until 9. Roman was there. He didn't try to resume the conversation. He put a plate in front of her without being asked, and she ate it, and they existed in the same space with a careful distance between them that was different from the careful distance of the early months. Heavier, more specific, shaped like the outline of everything that had been said. She went to bed. She woke at 2 in the morning with the particular clarity that sometimes comes from a few hours of unconscious processing, and she lay in the dark and thought about what she actually knew versus what she felt. What she knew, the contract was legal. The financial terms had been met. The exit clause existed. She had options. What she knew, he had deceived her by omission, deliberately and strategically. He had used her vulnerability and her need to construct a situation that served his purposes. What she knew, he had also been more consistently kind to her than any person in recent memory. What she knew, she was, in some complicated and poorly timed way, in love with him. What she felt, furious. She got up and went to the kitchen for water, and Roman was already there, sitting at the table in the dark with a glass of something that wasn't water. He looked up when she came in. "You don't sleep much either," she said. "Not lately." She got her water and stayed by the counter. "The people who moved against you," she said. 4 years ago. "Who are they?" He was quiet for a moment, then, "My cousins, Marco and Enzo Moretti, 2 senior advisors, a financial director named Calvin Hess." "And what did they actually do, specifically?" He looked at her. Something in her voice, the particular register of her professional focus, registered with him. "They restructured the voting allocation within the council without proper authority. They moved assets into personal accounts using a structure designed to look like legitimate management fees. They created documentation suggesting I had made operational decisions I never made to build a record that justified the removal." She was quiet. "How sophisticated?" she asked. "Sophisticated enough that 4 years ago I couldn't untangle it quickly enough to fight it. By the time I understood the full structure, the vote had already happened and I had 2 options: contest it publicly, which would have destroyed everything including the legitimate businesses, or go quiet and build a case." "What kind of documentation do they have?" "The falsified records, corporate minutes, transfer authorizations, communication records that have been selectively altered." "Digital?" "Some. Paper originals for the older material." "Where?" He looked at her steadily. "Why?" "Because I untangle fraudulent financial documentation for a living," she said. "And if what you're describing is a fabricated paper trail designed to support a fraudulent internal vote, then it has a structure, and structures have flaws." Roman was very still. "Charlotte," he said carefully, "you don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She set down her glass. "Tell me where the documentation is held." "You're angry with me." "Yes." "And you're offering to help anyway." "I'm angry with you for lying to me. I'm not angry at the situation. The situation is a straightforward financial fraud case, and those people," her voice went flat and precise, "are the kind of people I have spent my entire career learning how to take apart." He looked at her for a long moment. "The primary documentation," he said slowly, "is held in the corporate records division of Moretti Holdings, the building on Lexington. There's also a secondary archive held by Calvin Hess's personal attorney. I need access to the Moretti Holdings records. I can arrange that. Without anyone knowing what I'm doing, that's harder." "Then make it harder work," she said. "I'm not going in there with a flag." Roman looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the steadiness, not the control, but something underneath both of those things that was less armored. "Why?" he said. "Because they're criminals," she said simply. "The real kind. The kind who take what isn't theirs and build a structure around it and call it legitimate. I've been taking that apart my whole career, and I'm good at it." She picked up her water glass. "And because you didn't trap me." You had the exit clause drafted before I signed anything, and that was either calculated or decent, and either way the result was I could have left at any point, and I didn't. She moved toward the hallway. And because I'm furious with you and working is the only thing that makes me feel like the floor is solid right now. She paused at the corridor. I'm not forgiving you, she said. This is not forgiveness. I need you to understand that. I understand, he said. Good. She went back to bed. She didn't sleep, but the thoughts were different now. Organized, structural, the particular clarity that came when she had a problem with a shape she could work with. Fraudulent corporate records. Falsified authorizations. A paper trail designed to hold up under internal scrutiny, but probably not under forensic analysis. Probably not. She was going to find out. 3 days later, Roman arranged access. She went to the Moretti Holdings building on Lexington under the pretext of a financial review, legitimate cover, because the holdings company did engage external consultants, and a new review wasn't out of the ordinary. She went with a laptop and a briefcase and the specific posture of a person who belonged there, which she had perfected across 8 years of walking into hostile corporate environments and finding the thing that didn't add up. The records were in the corporate archive on the 3rd floor. She spent 6 hours with them. By the 4th hour, she had found the first flaw. By the 6th hour, she had found 7. The structure was sophisticated. Whoever had designed the falsification knew what they were doing. But knowing what you're doing and being perfect are different things. And they had made the particular mistake that sophisticated fraudsters often made. They had been too consistent. Real records had variants, real authorizations had typos, delays, inconsistent formatting. These records were clean in a way that real records almost never were. And the timestamps, when she cross-referenced them against the legitimate transaction logs, had a pattern that was 3 degrees off from what organic corporate behavior produced. She photographed everything relevant, took notes in the particular shorthand she'd developed over years. She was packing up when a man appeared in the archive doorway. Mid-50s, Italian suit, the kind of face that had once been handsome and had settled into something harder. He looked at her with an expression that was professionally neutral but contained underneath it a question. Ms. DeLuca, he said, using the name she'd entered under. I wasn't aware the review extended to the historical files. She looked at him. She knew the face from the brief she'd assembled. Calvin Hess. Financial director. One of the 4 who had moved against Roman 4 years ago. Standard scope, she said, keeping her voice even and her hand still on the briefcase clasp. I like to see the full picture. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Of course, he said. Of course you do. He stepped aside to let her pass. She walked past him and down the corridor to the elevator. And she did not change her pace, and she did not look back, and she kept her breathing controlled and measured until the elevator doors closed. Then she let out one long, slow breath. He knew. Maybe not everything, maybe not what she'd found, but he knew she was looking. She was in a cab back to the apartment when her phone buzzed. Roman, she answered. How did it go? He asked. I found what I needed, she said, but there's a problem. What problem? Calvin Hess saw me in the archive. A silence. Then, how much did he see? Enough to know I was looking at historical records. Enough to be suspicious. She watched the city move past the cab window. Roman, how much time do we have before the council vote? 4 weeks. Then we need to move faster than I planned. She paused. And you need to tell me something honestly. Yes. Is there anyone inside that organization who's loyal to you? Genuinely loyal, not strategically loyal, not people who'll shift when the wind changes. Actually loyal. A longer silence. 2 people, he said. Are they the kind of people who can move quickly if they need to? Yes. Then get them ready, she said, because Hess is going to start covering tracks the moment he figures out what I found, and we're going to have about 48 hours before the most useful evidence becomes inaccessible. The cab pulled up to the building. She got out and stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the windows of the 11th floor. Charlotte, his voice in her ear was low. I need you to understand what this means. If we move on this, if you put your name and your professional credibility behind what you've found, these are not people who respond well to being cornered. I know what they are, she said. Do you know what they'll do? She thought about Calvin Hess in the archive doorway, the smile that didn't reach his eyes, the particular quality of a man who had spent 4 years consolidating power he'd taken by fraud and was not going to surrender it willingly. Yes, she said, and you still want to do this. I already did it, she said. The question is what happens next. She hung up and went inside. The lobby security guard, a man named Gerald, who had been in that position every morning since she'd moved in, looked up when she entered, and she noticed for the first time that his posture was different, alert in a way that was professional rather than casual. He wasn't hotel security. She stood in the elevator and thought about all the things she had chosen not to assemble until now. Her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. She answered, "Ms. Whitmore." The voice was flat and controlled. Not Hess, younger, but carrying the same quality of someone who had learned to communicate through implication. "I think you found some things today that don't belong to you. I think it would be in everyone's best interest if we had a conversation about what you intend to do with them." She stood in the elevator as it reached the 11th floor. The doors opened. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "Of course you don't." A pause. "Ms. Whitmore, your mother lives on Clearfield Avenue in New Jersey. She works the morning shift at Jefferson Elementary. She leaves the house at 6:45. The elevator doors began to close. She put her hand out and stopped them. The cold she felt was not the March air. It was something older and more specific. "If you touch my mother," she said, and her voice was very quiet, "you will have made the worst decision of your life." "We're not threatening anyone," the voice said pleasantly. "We're having a conversation about what happens when people look at things that don't concern them." A pause. "Enjoy your evening, Miss Whitmore." The line went dead. She stood in the open elevator for 3 full seconds. Then she walked down the hall and opened the apartment door, and Roman was there, standing, already, like he'd felt the shape of the phone call through the walls. And she looked at him and said, "They know about my mother." She watched his face change, not slowly, not with the careful management she had come to associate with him. Something beneath the control surfaced, something that had been banked for 4 years and was now, for the first time in her presence, visible. "Who called?" he said, and his voice was different, quieter, the particular quiet of something pulled to its tightest point. "I don't know. Not Hess. Someone who works for him." He turned toward the window. His hands were at his sides and very still, and she could see the muscles in his jaw working, and he stood like that for 15 seconds. Then he turned back. "Pack a bag for your mother," he said. "Just the essentials. I'm calling Thomas in the next 30 seconds, and she'll be moved tonight." "You can't just move my mother." "Charlotte." He said her name the way he said very few things. Complete. Final. "They have identified her as leverage. That means she is not safe where she is. We can have a conversation about authority and consent and everything else after she is in a secure location. But right now, we have approximately 6 hours before whoever made that call decides that conversation wasn't convincing enough." She looked at him. She thought about being angry. She thought about the right to deliberate. She thought about everything she had said about controlling the architecture of her own decisions. She picked up her phone and called her mother. It rang 4 times, and then it went to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She looked at Roman. "She's not answering," she said. And the floor, which she had been working so hard to keep solid beneath her feet, dropped away entirely. She called 3 more times. Voicemail. 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 Roman was already on his phone, moving toward the window with his back to her, his voice low and precise in a way she was beginning to understand meant the controlled version of him had stepped aside and something older had taken its place. He was speaking in Italian, fast, clipped, the kind of cadence that didn't require responses so much as confirmations. Charlotte stood in the middle of the living room and breathed. She was good in emergencies. She had learned this about herself across years of walking into corporate crises where the numbers were wrong and the people were panicking and someone needed to hold the structure together long enough to find the thread. She did not freeze. She did not spiral. She moved to the next thing. The next thing was her mother's neighbor, a woman named Patrice, 70 years old, who watched her mother's cat when she traveled and had a key to the house and knew the neighborhood the way people who had lived somewhere for 40 years knew it, completely, without thinking about it. She found the number and called. Patrice picked up on the second ring. "Charlotte, honey?" "Patrice, is my mother home? Have you seen her tonight?" A pause. "I saw her car leave around 4. She mentioned she was going to the grocery, I think. That was a few hours ago." "She's not answering her phone." "Well, you know your mother. She probably left it in the car again." Another pause. "Is something wrong?" "I don't know yet." "Can you do me a favor? Can you go next door and check if her car is back?" "Of course. Give me just a—" The sound of movement, a door, outdoor air, a pause that lasted approximately 45 seconds. "Her car's in the driveway, Charlotte. Lights are on inside." Something in her chest released slightly. "Can you knock? Tell her to call me?" "Holding on." More movement. A knock. A pause. Then, muffled through the phone, her mother's voice. Querulous, surprised, alive. And then Patrice again. "She's there, hun. Says her phone died. She's getting her charger now." Charlotte sat down on the couch. Her legs had made the decision before she did. "Thank you, Patrice." She hung up. Across the room, Roman had turned and was watching her, his phone lowered. "She's home," Charlotte said. Phone was dead. He let out a breath. It was the first time she had seen him do that. Let something out. And the visibility of it did something to her she wasn't prepared for. "My people can still move her tonight," he said, just as a precaution. "That is not your decision to make. Charlotte, she is my mother." Her voice was even, but there was iron under it. "I will call her in 5 minutes when her phone is charged, and I will tell her enough to make her understand that she needs to go stay with my aunt in Connecticut for a week. And I will do that without sending strangers to her door in the middle of the night to pack her bags." She held his gaze. "That is not negotiable." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. She called her mother at 10:43. She kept it simple. There were some complications with a work situation, nothing dangerous, but she would feel better if her mother was out of the house for a few days. Could she call Aunt Rosa and go to Hartford? Yes, Charlotte would explain everything later. Yes, she was fine. No, she didn't need to worry. Yes, she was sure. Her mother asked 3 more questions and then agreed, because her mother had learned across 70 years of living that Charlotte didn't ask for things without reason, and that when she asked, it was worth taking seriously. She hung up and looked at Roman. "We have 4 weeks until the vote," she said, "and now they know I've seen the archive. So tell me exactly what we're working with and don't manage what you tell me." He sat across from her and he told her. It took 2 hours. The complete structure of the Moretti organization, not the public-facing holdings, not the sanitized version, but the actual architecture, the council of 12 senior members, the voting allocation, the mechanisms for leadership challenge and succession. The specific events of 4 years ago, in detail he hadn't given her before. The night the vote happened, the 2 members who had been pressured into switching their positions, the documentation that had been deployed to justify it, Marco and Enzo Moretti, his cousins. 10 and 12 years older than him, men who had spent 30 years believing they were passed over for leadership in favor of someone younger and less tested. Calvin Hess, who had been skimming from 3 accounts for 6 years and knew that Roman's forensic instincts would have found it within his first year of full leadership. And a 4th man, a council member named Driscoll, who had simply calculated that the new alignment offered him more than the old one. 4 people, she said. 4 people who had the specific relationships to move the other 8. And you have 2 loyalists on the council. 2 who have held consistently. 3 others who were coerced and would shift back if the evidence gave them cover. So 5 votes plus evidence plus whatever we can document. The council requires a 2/3 majority for a leadership decision. 8 votes. She did the math. You need 3 more. Yes. From people who are currently voting against you. Currently? Yes. She looked at the ceiling. The vote is in 4 weeks. Hess knows I was in the archive. How long before he figures out what specifically I was looking at? His people will have reviewed the access logs by morning. They'll know which files were opened. She noticed the correction. Which files I opened. Protecting her from the active formulation even now. So he'll know by morning, she said, which means the secondary archive, Hess's attorney. It becomes inaccessible. How quickly? Hours. If he moves tonight. She looked at the clock. 11:15. Can you get me into that archive? Roman was quiet for a moment. That's not a corporate records office, Charlotte. That's a private law firm that retains documents for a client. Getting in without authorization is... I'm not asking about authorization. I'm asking if you can get me in. He looked at her with something she couldn't fully read. Yes, he said. Then we go tonight. The law firm was on 53rd Street, a private practice that occupied the fourth floor of a building that also housed an accounting firm and a small consultancy. They were there by midnight. The building's overnight security was managed by a company that Thomas Crane had established with a single phone call, had a history of arrangements with the Moretti holding entities. The security guard on duty read something on his phone and then looked steadily at the middle distance for the duration of their time in the building. The fourth floor was dark. Roman moved through it with a familiarity that told her he'd been in places like this before. Not this office specifically, but spaces that needed to be navigated quietly. He disabled the internal alarm at the secondary panel without hesitation. She didn't ask how he knew the code. The document room was at the back. The files were organized by client and date. Hess's section was substantial, 12 years of retained documents in labeled folders. She worked fast, moving through the structure with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned to read archives under pressure. She wasn't looking for everything. She was looking for 3 specific categories: the original voting documentation, the financial transfer records, and the communication archive. She found the voting documentation first. She photographed it page by page. Then the financial records. Then, in a folder near the back labeled simply Correspondence M, she found something she wasn't looking for. She almost moved past it. The label was unremarkable, and she was moving fast, and her brain was organized around the specific evidence she'd come for. But something about the thickness of the folder stopped her. She pulled it. Inside were printed emails, organized by date. The earliest was 14 months ago. She read the first one, then the second. She stood in the dark document room with the folder in her hands and read 4 more, and then she stopped because she needed to stop. Because continuing to read while standing was not something she was capable of doing in this moment. She sat down on the floor. Roman came around the filing cabinet and saw her and went very still. "What is it?" he said. She held up the folder. He took it, read the first page. She watched his face in the low light, and she watched something move across it that she had never seen there before. Not the controlled management, not the practiced composure, but something raw and ancient and deeply specific. He kept reading. She let him. When he reached the end, he lowered the folder and stood with it at his side and looked at the wall. The emails were between Calvin Hess and a financial intermediary whose name Charlotte recognized from her own professional world, a man who brokered sensitive asset movements for clients who needed distance from their transactions. The emails documented, across 14 months, the systematic dismantling of the Whitmore Foundation's donor base, not passively, not incidentally, actively. 3 of the foundation's largest donors had withdrawn in the past year, citing vague concerns about financial management. The emails showed those concerns had been manufactured and seeded through third-party contacts. The loans Charlotte had applied for and been rejected, 2 of those rejections had been coordinated. The debt restructuring that had made Bradley Hayes walk away from the engagement. Someone had made sure the right people at the right dinner parties heard the right version of the Whitmore family's financial situation. They had not found Charlotte because she had been at the Meridian the night of the gala, and Roman had happened to be mopping that corridor. They had manufactured the circumstances that put her there. She looked at Roman. "You didn't find me," she said. His jaw was tight. "Roman." Her voice had gone to a place she didn't entirely recognize. "You didn't find me. They put me in front of you." "Charlotte, they knew you were looking for a reason to surface. They knew you needed a personal circumstance, a stable life, to bring to the council. They manufactured a woman desperate enough to say yes to a contract marriage and put her in your path." She stood up from the floor. "I was a setup. They wanted you to surface. They wanted you to bring a wife to the council, because they have something they can use against her." She watched it land on him, watched him work through it. "They wanted me to come out of cover," he said slowly. "They needed me visible for the vote to have final authority, and they needed a vulnerability to use if the evidence went against them." "And here I am," she said. "The vulnerability." The folder sat between them. She thought about the last year of her life. the donor withdrawals, the loan rejections. Bradley at the gala, with his particular expression of a man delivering a pre-made decision, the way her financial situation had seemed to close down from multiple directions simultaneously. She had attributed it to bad luck and compounding debt and the brutal arithmetic of American healthcare. It had been a construction. How much of it was them, she said. The debt was real. My father's medical bills were real. Yes, Roman said. The debt was real. The bills were real. But He stopped. Say it. The speed of the collapse, the specific timing, the donor withdrawals coming in the same quarter, those were accelerated. His voice was careful in the way it was when he was making sure each word was true. They found a real situation, and they pushed it faster. She absorbed that. They made sure I had no options, she said, so that when your people came with one, I'd take it. Yes. She looked at him. And you had no idea. The pause was a fraction too long. She felt it like a change in air pressure. Roman. I didn't know about this, he said, gesturing to the folder. This specific operation, I didn't know they targeted you. But, his jaw tightened, but I knew the circumstances that brought you to my attention were convenient, he said. I knew a woman in your specific situation arriving in my specific path on that specific night was statistically unlikely. I chose to... He stopped. You chose to what? I chose to accept it. She stared at him. You knew it was too convenient, she said, and you didn't investigate. You just accepted it because you needed what I offered and you didn't want to know if it was manufactured. Charlotte, don't. Her voice cracked on the consonant. Don't explain the calculus. I understand the calculus. You needed a wife and the situation offered you one, and asking too many questions would have cost you an asset. She pressed her hand flat against the filing cabinet. I was an asset. You were never... That is what I was, Roman. Before I was anything else to you, I was a solution to a problem. And when the circumstances of my arrival felt off, you looked the other way because investigating them might have given you an answer that closed the option. He didn't deny it. That was the thing. He didn't deny it. She picked up her camera and the photograph she'd taken and walked out of the document room. He followed her out of the building and into the street, and neither of them spoke for half a block, and the city was quiet and cold the way it got in the deep hours after midnight, when even New York had run out of things to say. I'm sorry, he said. I know. That's not enough. No, she agreed. It's not. She kept walking. He walked with her, maintaining a half step of distance that she recognized as the specific distance of a man who understood he had forfeited the right to anything closer. The evidence we have, she said finally, because the evidence was a problem that existed independently of how she felt, and problems with shapes could be worked. The archive photographs, plus what we found tonight, it's sufficient for the financial fraud elements. The voting manipulation is substantiated, but the communication records, she gestured to the folder he was carrying, they changed the defense strategy. Because now Hess doesn't just know I've seen the financial records. He knows I've found the correspondence. He'll move on the secondary evidence by morning. Can he access what I photographed? No. What's on your camera is yours, and the original's in that folder. He'll have them removed or destroyed before any formal process could compel their production. She thought about that. Then we need to move before he does. Not 4 weeks, not even 4 days. The council vote isn't scheduled. I know when the vote is scheduled. I'm telling you, we can't wait for it. She stopped walking, turned to face him. Hess made a threat about my mother tonight. He had someone call me within hours of my being in that archive. That means he's not going to sit and wait for the vote either. He's going to move first. Against you, against me, against whatever evidence he thinks we have. Roman was looking at her with that expression again, the one she'd seen in the ballroom when he'd found her face in the crowd and braced for what she'd do. If we move on the council before the scheduled vote, he said, we need 8 members present and willing. We need the evidence in a form that can be reviewed. We need... Can you call an emergency session? An emergency session requires... Can you call one? He was quiet. As the contested leader, he said slowly, I retain the technical authority to call an emergency session pending the formal vote. It's never been used. Technically, it's still in the charter. Then call it. If we call it without having all 8 votes locked, We hand Hess the floor. He'll use whatever he has against us before we can present. I know. She met his eyes, which is why I need 72 hours with this evidence before you call anything. 72 hours for what? To build a case that doesn't just prove what they did, she said, but proves it in a way that gives the 3 coerced council members no choice but to switch. Not because they want to. Because the alternative is having their names attached to a fraud that I can document to the last decimal point. She held his gaze. I've done this before, Roman. Different context, same mechanics. You show someone exactly how visible their participation is, and you show them what the alternative looks like, and then you let them make the rational choice. He looked at her for a long moment. You're going to use the correspondence, he said. The emails about the foundation. No. She said it quietly. I'm going to use everything else first. The foundation correspondence is personal. I'm not using personal material to build a professional case. That's sloppy, and it compromises the integrity of the evidence. Something moved across his face. You just found out they dismantled your life on purpose, he said, and you're not going to use it. I'm going to use things that are useful, she said. Anger doesn't make good evidence. Clean documentation does. She turned and started walking again. I need a workspace, not the apartment, somewhere neutral. I can arrange it. I need access to everything you have, not the version you've been managing, everything. Yes. And I need you to stay out of my way while I work. A pause. Understood. She walked. He kept pace. At the next corner, she said, without looking at him, when this is over, when the vote happens and the evidence is in, I'm invoking the exit clause. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was level. All right. I need you to know that now, before I do this. I'm not doing it for the marriage. I'm doing it because those people engineered the worst year of my life and used my father's death as a mechanism, and I want them to lose. I understand. Good. They walked the rest of the block in silence, and the city absorbed them the way it absorbed everything. Without ceremony, without significance. The way New York received all the private devastations that happened inside its coordinates and simply continued. But at the door to the building, Charlotte stopped. Roman stopped with her. She stood for a moment, and she thought about the folder she had found in the back of that filing cabinet. The emails that traced the careful, deliberate dismantling of the Whitmore Foundation's donor base. The manufactured concerns about financial management, the coordinated loan rejections, the seated conversations at the right dinner parties. They had used her father's death. They had found a real grief and a real debt, and a real woman falling through a real floor, and they had pushed. She thought about what her father had built, the foundation, the work, the families in the outer boroughs who had received assistance with medical costs they couldn't have navigated alone, the man who had died believing that what he'd constructed would outlast him. She thought about what it meant to let that go unaddressed. She picked up her phone and called Thomas Crane. He answered on the 3rd ring, which meant he was awake, which meant Roman had already made a call she hadn't witnessed. Ms. Whitmore, Thomas said. I need a secure workspace by 8 a.m., she said. Full document processing capability, and I need you to contact a woman named Patricia Ng, my attorney, and have her available by phone from 8 onwards. Don't tell her why yet. Just make sure she's available. Of course. And Thomas, she paused. The 2 council members Roman trusts. I need their personal contact information, not through intermediaries. Direct. A brief pause. I'll need Mr. Moretti's authorization. She glanced at Roman, who was standing close enough to hear and who gave a single nod. You have it, she said. 8 a.m. She hung up. The elevator arrived and they got in and rode up in the particular silence of 2 people who had said everything important and had no performance left for anything else. At the apartment door, she stopped with the key in the lock. Roman. Yes. She didn't look at him. When you read those emails tonight, in the document room, your face, she paused. That was the first time I've seen you not manage it. He was quiet. What you built, she said. What I'm about to spend 72 hours protecting. The organization, the empire, or whatever it is. She turned the key. Is it worth it? To you? Honestly. He thought about it. She gave him the time. Parts of it, he said finally. The legitimate infrastructure. The people who work inside it who don't know or participate in the rest. The capacity to do some things right. Yes. A pause. Some of it I would take apart myself if I could do it without destroying what's worth keeping. She opened the door. Then let's keep what's worth keeping, she said, and went inside. She did not sleep. By 3 a.m, she was at the kitchen table with the photographs from the archive organized into a working structure, and the folder from Hess's attorney set to one side, and her laptop open to the Moretti Holdings public filings she'd been cross-referencing for weeks. The shape of the fraud was becoming clear. It was elegant, in the way that well-constructed lies are elegant. Each element supporting the others, the falsified records interlocking with the manipulated votes, interlocking with the financial diversions in a structure designed to be self-reinforcing. Pulling any single thread would cause the others to compensate. But she wasn't going to pull a single thread. She was going to pull all of them simultaneously. She worked until 6, and then she showered and changed and was ready at the door at 7:40 when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Not Thomas Crane's format, not Roman's number. A photograph. She opened it. It was an image of a parking garage, taken recently. The timestamp showed 40 minutes ago. In the frame, partially visible between two parked vehicles, was a woman in a winter coat getting into a car. Her mother, not in Connecticut, still in New Jersey, still at home. The text beneath the image said, "She didn't leave. Thought you should know we're still watching. The offer to have a conversation stands. Destroy the photographs and walk away from whatever you're building, and this stays civilized." Charlotte stared at the message for 10 seconds. Then she forwarded it to Roman with a single line. "They're still watching her. She didn't go to Rosa's yet." His response came back in under a minute. "My people are already there. She's safe." But Charlotte, she waited. The second message came through. "Marco Moretti just called an emergency council session for tomorrow morning. He's not waiting for the scheduled vote. He's moving tonight." She read that twice. Then she picked up her bag and walked to the door and stopped. 72 hours had just become 12. And somewhere in the architecture of what she'd built across one sleepless night, there was either enough to win or there was nothing. And she was about to find out which, and the specific nature of her fear in this moment was not about the council or the vote or even her mother, but about the thing she'd been about to think finished itself in the cab. She was afraid that what she'd built across one sleepless night wasn't enough. Not because the evidence was weak. The evidence was the best work she'd ever done, clean and layered and documented to a standard that would hold in any formal proceeding. She was afraid because she had built it for 72 hours, and she had 11. And the difference between those two numbers was the difference between a structure that had been tested and one that hadn't. She called Thomas Crane from the back seat. "The emergency session," she said. What time?" 9 a.m. Moretti Tower. Marco called it 40 minutes ago under the emergency charter provision. Same provision Roman holds. He got there first. Can Roman contest the call? He can appear. The charter requires the contested leader be given the opportunity to present before any binding vote. But Charlotte... Thomas paused, and Thomas Crane did not pause, which told her everything. "Marco has the room. He's had 4 years to work those council members. Roman walking in there this morning with a counter-presentation is, the odds are not favorable. What time is it now?" 6:52. 2 hours and 8 minutes. "I need you to contact Patricia Ng right now," she said. "Not at 8. Now. Wake her up." "What do I tell her?" "Tell her to be at Moretti Tower by 8:30 with her notary seal and her recording equipment and her willingness to have the most interesting morning of her professional life." She hung up. The cab stopped at a light, and she looked out the window at the city going gray and pale in the early morning, the delivery trucks and the dog walkers and the people with coffee moving through their ordinary Tuesdays. And she thought about the specific problem of walking into a room controlled by your enemies with evidence they were already trying to destroy and 2 hours to make it count. She called Roman. He picked up before the first ring completed, which meant he'd been holding the phone. "I need everything you have on the 3 coerced council members," she said. "Not background. Specifically what Hess used to pressure them. The leverage." "Charlotte, the session is in 2 hours. I know when the session is. What did Hess use?" A pause. She heard him moving. "One of them, Caruso, has a son with a gambling problem. Hess has documentation of debts that would embarrass the family. The second, a man named Park, had a business arrangement with one of Hess's entities that wasn't fully disclosed to the council. The third, Benedetti, is more complicated. He shifted because Hess convinced him Roman was planning to dismantle the organization entirely. Not because he was threatened, because he was misled. So Benedetti is a true believer in the wrong story. Yes. Then Benedetti is easiest. I show him the right story and he moves. She was already pulling documents from her bag onto her lap in the back of the cab, working through the structure in her head. Caruso and Park need the leverage neutralized. Can you neutralize it in... She checked her watch. An hour and 50 minutes? Caruso's son's debt. If that debt no longer exists, can you make it not exist? Yes. Do it now. She turned to Paige. Park's undisclosed arrangement with Hess's entity. If Park's attorney of record were to receive documentation confirming the arrangement had been quietly dissolved and no claim would be pursued, I'd need Thomas to move on that. Thomas is awake. Call him. She looked at the page in her hand. Roman, the council session. Marco called it, which means he controls the agenda. How do we get floor time? The charter gives the contested leader the right to present before the vote. But Marco controls how much time. How much can he legally limit it to? The charter says sufficient time. It's deliberately vague. Then we need someone in that room who can argue the definition of sufficient. She paused. Is there a council member who respects procedure? Not necessarily loyal to you, but someone who would object to a procedural violation on principle? Roman thought for exactly 3 seconds. Alderman. Vincent Alderman. He's voted against me, but he's a formalist. He wrote 2 of the charter provisions himself. He would object to a procedural shortcut on instinct. Can you call him before 9? I can call him now. Tell him you're presenting material evidence of fraud and that you need sufficient time to be defined as not less than 30 minutes. Don't ask him to vote for you. Just ask him to hold the procedure. Another pause. That might work. It has to work, she said, because without 30 minutes, I can't build the sequence correctly, and without the sequence, the 3 swing votes don't move in time. The cab pulled up to the workspace Thomas had arranged, a conference room on the 8th floor of a building on 47th Street, clean and neutral, and equipped with a printer and a scanner and a screen. She was out of the cab before it fully stopped, taking the stairs because the elevator would take 40 seconds she didn't have. Patricia Ng arrived at 8:26, 4 minutes ahead of schedule, wearing the expression of a woman who had been woken at 6:52 and had decided on the way over to be professionally magnificent about it. Tell me, Patricia said. Charlotte told her, fast, structured, the version that covered the essential architecture without the personal dimensions. Forensic financial fraud, falsified corporate voting records, a family council session in 32 minutes. Patricia listened without interrupting. When Charlotte finished, Patricia said, You want me there as a witness and notary. I want you there as a professional whose presence signals that what I'm presenting has been vetted by independent counsel. Has it been vetted by independent counsel? It's being vetted right now by independent counsel, Charlotte said, and pushed the document stack across the table. You have 25 minutes. Patricia looked at the stack, looked at Charlotte. You did this overnight. Yes. In how many hours? Enough hours. Patricia pulled the stack toward her and started reading. Charlotte printed the final documents, organized the presentation sequence, and called Roman at 8:47. Caruso's son's debt, Roman said. Done. The creditor received a full settlement at 8:30. Thomas handled it. A pause. Park's situation is resolved. His attorney confirmed receipt of the dissolution documents 10 minutes ago. An alderman? He'll hold the procedure. 30 minutes guaranteed. A pause that carried something heavier. Charlotte, Marco has something. I don't know what, but he wouldn't have called the session without a countermove. He knew I'd come with evidence. He has something to deploy against it. She thought about the phone call, the photograph of her mother in the parking garage, the offer to walk away. He has the correspondence, she said. What? The emails about the foundation, my family. He might not have the originals anymore. Not after we were in that archive last night. But he'll have copies. He was always going to have copies. She pressed her palm flat on the conference table. He's going to use me, in that room. He's going to produce the correspondence and argue that you knowingly entered a marriage with a woman whose circumstances were manufactured, that you were aware of the setup, and that it demonstrates a pattern of manipulation that disqualifies you from leadership. Silence on the line. Can he make that case? She said. He can try to make that case. Can he make it stick? If the council believes I knew that I used you knowingly, did you? She said. Definitively. When you chose me, did you know? I did not know the specifics. I suspected the convenience. That is different from knowing. Is it different enough for 8 council members to see the distinction under pressure in a room Marco controls? He didn't answer immediately. We have to go, she said. We deal with what he has when he deploys it. She gathered the documents. Patricia looked up from the stack. This is sufficient, Patricia said. The fraud case is substantiated. I'd stake my bar license on the financial records alone. She paused. The circumstantial narrative around the voting manipulation is strong, but not airtight. You'd want more time to reinforce it in a formal proceeding. We don't have more time. I know. Patricia stood and picked up her bag. Then we go. Moretti Tower was on Lexington, a glass and steel building that presented its legitimate face to the street and held its more complex interior behind access protocols that Thomas Crane navigated at the ground floor with 3 words spoken quietly to the man at the security desk. They went up. The council chamber was on the 22nd floor. Charlotte had never been in it. She'd imagined something theatrical, heavy wood, the aesthetic of power performing itself. What she found was a long conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows and 12 chairs arranged around an oval table and the specific temperature of a room where the air conditioning had been running all night. 10 people were already there when they arrived. Marco Moretti was at the head of the table. She recognized him from photographs. Late 50s, silver at the temples, his father's jaw on a face that had cultivated a particular expression of authority over decades of waiting for a seat that had gone to his younger cousin instead. He looked at Charlotte when she entered, and his expression didn't change, which was its own form of communication. Beside him, Calvin Hess. Hess looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected her to come and had prepared for it, which was more honest than the smile he'd given her in the archive and considerably more alarming. The other 8 council members were arranged around the table. She clocked them fast. The 2 Roman loyalists she'd spoken to by phone at 4 in the morning, a woman named Reyes and an older man named Castellan, sitting on the near side with a specific quality of readiness. Caruso, heavy-set, whose phone had presumably received a notification about his son's cleared debt within the last hour, sitting with his hands flat on the table and his expression suspended between old allegiance and arithmetic. Park, across from him, whose attorney had received dissolution documents before 8. Benedetti, at the far end, whose defection had been ideological rather than coerced. Alderman, between Park and Benedetti, with the posture of a man who had come to enforce procedure and was prepared to do exactly that and nothing more. And 3 others she'd been briefed on, Galvani, Torres, Whitfield, whose positions she assessed as genuinely held rather than pressured, which made them the hardest to move and the most important to reach. Roman entered behind her. The room shifted. Not dramatically. These were people who had spent their lives managing reaction. But she felt it. The specific gravitational adjustment of a space accommodating someone whose authority was contested but not extinguished. Marco stood. This session has been called under Charter Provision 7, he said. The question before the council is the formal confirmation of leadership following the provisional period. Before the vote, both parties will be given floor time. He looked at Roman. Provision 7 allows the council chair to determine the allocation of presentation time based on the nature of the material. Provision 7, said Alderman from the far end without inflection, also specifies that the contested party receives sufficient time. The charter uses that word precisely. Sufficient. I'll be raising a point of order if the time allocated is insufficient to review material evidence. Marco's eyes moved to Alderman. Something passed between them. 40 minutes per party, Marco said. Charlotte put her hand on Roman's arm, a light touch, barely contact, and he looked at her. Let me go first, she said quietly. He held her gaze. Then he sat. She stood up. The room looked at her with various forms of the same question. Who is this woman, and what does she think she's doing? She had thought about this moment at 3 in the morning, and again in the cab, and again in the elevator, and she had decided, across all those iterations, that the answer to the room's unspoken question was the same answer she had been arriving at her entire professional life. She was the person who found the thread, and she was about to pull it in front of 12 people, some of whom had helped construct what was being unraveled, and she was going to do it in 40 minutes, and she was not going to perform any part of it. "My name is Charlotte Whitmore," she said. "I'm a forensic financial consultant. I've been working in that capacity for 8 years, and in that time I've documented 4 separate cases of large-scale corporate fraud, 2 of which resulted in criminal referral." She picked up the first document from the stack Patricia had organized. "I'm going to show you something that was built over 4 years inside this organization, and I'm going to show it to you in a sequence that I need you to follow completely before you respond, because the sequence is the argument." She placed the first document on the table and pushed it toward the center. "This is the voting record from 4 years ago," she said. "The session that resulted in the provisional leadership transfer. I want to direct your attention to the timestamps." She walked them through it. She had 38 minutes before Marco moved, and she used all of them. She did not rush, and she did not simplify, and she did not perform emotion. She laid the documents in the order she'd designed, and she explained each one in the language of her profession. Precise, technical, demonstrable, and she watched the room as she did it. She watched Caruso's hands, which had been flat on the table at the start, slowly curl. She watched Park, who had the specific stillness of a man processing information that changed the architecture of a decision he'd thought was settled. She watched Benedetti, who had voted against Roman because he'd believed Roman intended to dismantle what his family had spent 3 generations building, and she placed in front of him the document that showed the legitimate infrastructure of Moretti Holdings, the employment numbers, the community-facing operations, the entities that had nothing to do with anything criminal, and she said simply, "This is what the man you voted against has been protecting for 4 years. From the inside." Benedetti looked at the document for a long time. She was on the penultimate section. The communication records between Hess and his intermediaries, the coordination of the fraudulent voting documentation, when Marco stood. "I need to introduce counter-evidence," he said. Alderman looked at his watch. "The 38 minutes aren't... This is responsive to material just presented. The charter allows responsive evidence." Alderman paused. Technically correct. Marco placed a folder on the table. Charlotte recognized it. Not the original. The originals were in the photographs on her camera, and the copies she'd made last night, and the originals from Hess's attorney's archive were presumably destroyed by now. But copies. Printed clean, organized by date. The correspondence about the Whitmore Foundation, her donors, her loans, the engineered collapse of her family's financial situation. "The woman presenting this evidence," Marco said, "was placed in proximity to Roman Moretti through a deliberate operation." He said it calmly, factually, the tone of a man presenting administrative information. "These documents show the operation. Roman Moretti's marriage, the personal stability he's presenting to this council as evidence of his fitness for leadership, was manufactured. His wife's financial crisis was engineered to make her available. Roman knew the circumstances were convenient. He chose not to investigate. That is not the judgment of someone who should lead this organization." The room was quiet. Charlotte stood at the head of the table with the last document in her hand. She looked at Marco. She looked at Hess, who was watching her with that expression. The one from the archive doorway, the assessment, the calculation. She looked at the folder Marco had placed on the table, the copies of the emails, the documented dismantling of everything her father had built. She thought about what she'd told Roman last night. Anger doesn't make good evidence. Clean documentation does. She put down the document she'd been holding. She picked up a different one. "You're right," she said to Marco. The room shifted. "The circumstances of my introduction to Roman Moretti were not accidental. My family's financial situation was accelerated by deliberate external action. I was identified as a viable candidate for a contract arrangement and positioned accordingly." She kept her voice level. "I found the documentation of that operation last night." She placed the document she'd chosen on the table. "This is it, in your cousin's handwriting, approved by you." Marco's expression didn't move. "You ran the operation," she said. "Not Hess. Hess executed it, but the authorization is yours. The margin note on the third email, the one that reads approved, keep it clean. That's your handwriting, Mr. Moretti. I've had it compared against 3 other documents bearing your signature that are on file with the holding's corporate secretary. She tapped the comparison sheet she'd prepared at 4 in the morning when she'd found the margin note and understood what it meant. You built the trap. You put me in Roman's path. And then you plan to use me in this room today to argue that he lacks the judgment to lead. The silence was complete. Which means, she said, that everything you've argued in this session about Roman's fitness, about manufactured circumstances, about judgment, is an argument you constructed and then walked into this room and delivered, knowing you built it. That's not a counterargument. That's a confession of the operation's existence. Marco's jaw tightened. Hess moved, slightly, in his chair. The specific movement of a man revising his position. Caruso spoke first. I want to see the handwriting comparison, he said. Charlotte pushed it across the table. It traveled around the room. She watched faces. She watched Parks study it with the meticulous attention of a man whose professional survival had always depended on reading documents correctly. She watched Benedetti, who had gone very still. She watched Galvani and Torres and Whitfield, the 3 she'd assessed as genuinely held rather than pressured, and she watched them do the arithmetic. Alderman, at the end of the table, looked up from the comparison sheet. I have a procedural question, he said. Everyone looked at him. The initial vote 4 years ago, he said carefully. If the documentation supporting that vote was falsified, and if the voting allocation was altered without proper authority, then the vote itself was not valid under the charter. He looked at Marco. Which means the provisional leadership arrangement that followed it was not valid, which means, he looked at Roman, there's nothing to confirm, because the transfer of authority never legally occurred. The room absorbed that. Marco said, that's a legal interpretation that would require a charter review, Alderman said, which I am formally requesting. Right now. Under Provision 4. He looked at Charlotte. If the forensic documentation supports the conclusion that the initial vote was procedurally invalid, then this council has no basis for a confirmation session today because there was never a legitimate transfer to confirm. Charlotte picked up the last document in her stack. The forensic documentation, she said, supports exactly that conclusion. I can walk you through the specific procedural violations in the original vote, cross-referenced with the charter provisions they contravene, in approximately 20 minutes. Alderman looked at his watch. You have 17 minutes remaining. That's enough, she said. She started talking. She was on the 14th minute when Calvin Hess stood up. The room looked at him. He straightened his jacket, looked at Marco. Then he sat back down. That was all. He sat back down. And Charlotte understood, in the specific language of people who had spent their careers reading rooms, that Calvin Hess had just done his own arithmetic and arrived at a different answer than the one he'd walked in with. She finished the presentation. The room was quiet. Roman had not spoken once during her 40 minutes. He sat at the table with his hands flat and his face controlled, and he had let her work without interruption or addition, and she was aware, in some part of her, that she wasn't examining closely right now, that this was itself a kind of answer to a question she hadn't asked. Alderman said, I'm calling for a charter review vote. All those in favor of suspending today's confirmation session pending a formal review of the original voting documentation. Reyes said yes. Castellan said yes. Caruso said yes. Park said yes. Benedetti, after a pause that lasted 4 full seconds, said yes. Alderman said yes. Galvani looked at Torres. Torres looked at Whitfield. Marco was very still at the head of the table. Hess was looking at his hands. Galvani said yes. Torres said yes. Charlotte stood at the presentation end of the table and kept her face composed and watched Whitfield, who was the last, who had the specific expression of someone who had understood from the beginning that this moment would arrive and had spent 4 years hoping it wouldn't. Whitfield looked at Marco. Marco's expression was unreadable. Whitfield looked back at the table. Yes, he said. The vote was 9-1. Marco did not vote. Hess did not vote. The charter review was called. The confirmation session was suspended. The room began to move with the specific energy of people who had made a decision and were now managing its consequences, pulling out phones, exchanging low words, the council members Caruso and Park already moving toward Roman with the particular body language of people resetting a relationship. Charlotte gathered her documents. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. She had expected them to shake. Patricia appeared at her elbow. "That," Patricia said quietly, "was the most precise 38-minute demolition I have ever witnessed." 17, Charlotte said. "What?" "The last part took 17 minutes, not 20. The evidence was cleaner than I thought." Patricia looked at her. "Are you all right?" Charlotte looked across the room. Roman was standing with Castellan and Reyes, the two loyalists, and he was listening to something Castellan was saying with that quality of controlled attention she'd spent 5 months learning to read. And then, as if he felt the specific weight of her looking, he turned. Their eyes met across the length of the conference room. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took her to understand what she saw in it, and then she looked away. She picked up her bag. "I need air," she told Patricia. She took the elevator down and walked out of the building into the Lexington Avenue morning, and the city was fully awake now, the full volume of a Tuesday in motion, and she stood on the sidewalk with her documents under her arm and the cold air on her face and the particular exhaustion of a person who had spent every reserve they had and was only now, standing still, beginning to feel the cost. Her phone buzzed. Roman. She looked at the notification for a moment. Then she answered. "It's done," she said. "Yes." His voice was quiet. "Charlotte, I'm going to Patricia's office," she said. "I need to file the exit clause paperwork today while I still have the clarity to do it." A silence. "I understand," he said. "I know you do." She looked up at the building. 22 floors above her, a room full of people were resetting the architecture of something she had never fully understood and had spent 5 months living inside. "Roman, whatever the charter review finds, whatever happens with the council, you should know that what I presented today, that was clean work. It stands on its own. It doesn't depend on anything between us." "I know," he said. "It was extraordinary work." She closed her eyes for 1 second. "I'll be in touch about the logistics," she said. "The apartment. Take whatever time you need." She lowered the phone. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer, and the city moved around her, and somewhere above her in a glass tower on Lexington Avenue, the man she had married was standing in the wreckage of something that might now be rebuilt. And somewhere in New Jersey, her mother was still at home because she'd never gotten on the road to Connecticut. And somewhere in a court filing that Patricia would prepare this afternoon was a document with Charlotte's name on it that would begin the careful unwinding of 5 months of complicated, honest, devastating. Her phone buzzed again. Not Roman. An unknown number. New one. Different area code. She answered because she had answered an unknown number once before, and it had changed everything, and she had learned, apparently, nothing. Ms. Whitmore. A woman's voice. Controlled. Professional. "My name is Agent Sandra Okafor. I'm with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Unit." A pause. "We've been monitoring the Moretti Holdings corporate structure for 18 months. This morning we received an anonymous submission, a complete forensic documentation package of internal fraud within the organization, timestamp 6:47 a.m. Another pause. "The submission is signed with your professional credentials. I was hoping you could come in and speak with us about." She stood on the sidewalk with the phone against her ear, and the city moving around her, and thought, with a clarity that was almost funny, that she should have seen this coming. "Ms. Whitmore," Agent Okafor said again. "Are you there?" "I'm here," Charlotte said. "The submission we received this morning." "I know what the submission contains. I built it." She shifted the documents under her arm. "I didn't submit it." A pause. "Someone submitted it under your credentials." "I understand that. Give me 20 minutes. She hung up. She stood still for 3 seconds, which was all she allowed herself, and then she called Roman. He picked up immediately. "Someone submitted the documentation package to Financial Crimes Enforcement," she said, "under my name, 20 minutes ago." The silence on his end had a specific texture. "Thomas," he said, not a question. "I don't know. Thomas sent it." His voice had gone to that quiet place, the pulled-tight place. "Before the session. As insurance." "Did you authorize that?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be its own answer. "No," he said, But I fast should have anticipated it. Thomas operates on a specific principle. He protects the organization's interests before he protects any individual within it. If he calculated that a federal submission would neutralize Marco's faction more permanently than a council vote. Roman, she cut him off. My credentials, my professional license, my name on a federal submission to a financial crimes unit without my knowledge or consent. She kept her voice level because leveling her voice was the only thing available to her right now. Do you understand what that means for me? Another silence. Yes, he said. I need you to fix it. Charlotte, I'm going to Agent Okafor's office in 20 minutes, and I'm going to walk in there and explain that the submission was made without my authorization, and I need you to have Thomas Crane available to confirm that by the time I arrive. Do you understand? Yes. And Roman. She looked up at the building one more time. After this, after I walk out of that federal office, we are done. The exit clause, the apartment, the arrangement, all of it. I need it finished. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet and precise and carried the particular weight of a man who had said insufficient things at critical moments and knew it. I'll have Thomas available, he said. And Charlotte, I'm sorry, for Thomas. For all of it. I know that doesn't... I know you know, she said, and hung up. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Field Office was on the 6th floor of a federal building on Varick Street, and Agent Sandra Okafor turned out to be a woman in her early 40s with close-cropped hair and the specific economy of movement that Charlotte associated with people who spent their days in rooms where every detail was being evaluated. She met Charlotte in a small conference room with a recorder on the table and a legal pad, and the expression of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that the most useful thing she could offer was patience. Charlotte sat down. She told the truth. All of it. Not the version that protected Roman, not the version that minimized her own involvement, not the version that made her look like a victim or a hero or anything other than what she was. A forensic accountant who had entered a contract arrangement without full information, discovered financial fraud of significant scope, built a documented case in 13 hours, and had that case submitted under her name by a third party without her knowledge or consent. She placed the original documents on the table, the photographs from the archive, the comparison sheet on Marco's handwriting, the complete fraud package she'd built overnight. This is everything I compiled, she said. It's clean. The methodology is sound, and I'll defend it in any proceeding you choose. But I did not authorize the submission under my credentials. The man who did that was acting on his own judgment, and I need that documented before we go further. Okafor looked at the documents, looked at Charlotte. Thomas Crane, she said, reading from her notes. He's confirmed the unauthorized submission. We received his statement 40 minutes ago. Charlotte blinked. He confirmed it himself. Voluntarily, before you called us. Okafor set down her pen. Ms. Whitmore, the documentation you've assembled this is 18 months of work for my unit, organized in a format I've never seen a private consultant produce in. How long did you say? 13 hours. Okafor looked at her for a moment. The fraud case against Calvin Hess, Marco Moretti, and 2 associated parties is substantiated by what you've brought us. We'll need your cooperation as a professional witness during the investigative phase. She paused. The unauthorized submission of your credentials is a separate matter that doesn't affect the evidentiary value of the documentation itself. Your professional license is not at risk. Something in Charlotte's chest released. She had not known, until it released, how tightly she'd been holding it. What happens now? She said. Now we do our jobs, Okafor said simply, which takes considerably longer than 13 hours. Charlotte nodded. She stood, and Okafor stood with her, and they shook hands at the door with the specific formality of 2 professionals who had just established the terms of a working relationship. Miss Whitmore, Okafor said. One more thing. Charlotte turned. The Whitmore Foundation. The donor withdrawal campaign, the coordinated loan rejections, that's a separate federal matter. Interstate fraud, potentially wire fraud. We'll be looking at it. She paused. I thought you should know it won't be ignored. Charlotte looked at her. She thought about her father, about the foundation and what it had been built for and the families in the outer boroughs, and the work that had nearly been quietly strangled while Charlotte had been blaming herself for not holding the numbers together. Thank you, she said. She walked out into the Varick Street afternoon. It was past noon. The morning had consumed itself somewhere in the hours between Moretti Tower and this federal building, and the city had moved through its full Tuesday arc while Charlotte had been inside various rooms doing various forms of the same thing she always did, finding the thread, pulling it, holding the shape of what unraveled. She was very tired. She found a coffee shop on the next block and sat at a window table and ordered something and sat with it untouched for a while, watching the street. She called her mother. Her mother answered on the first ring. "Charlotte, I've been trying to reach you all morning." "I know, Mom. I'm sorry. Are you home?" "Yes, I'm home." "What on earth is going on? You called last night saying to go to Rose's and then I couldn't reach you." "The situation has resolved," Charlotte said. "You don't need to go to Rose's. I'll explain everything when I see you. Are you okay?" "I'm fine. I'm just worried about you." A pause. "You sound tired." "I am tired." "Come home for the weekend. I'll make the soup." Charlotte closed her eyes. "Yeah," she said. "I'll come home." She sat with her coffee until it was cold, and then she paid and walked outside and stood on the sidewalk with no particular direction and thought about the exit clause. Patricia had the paperwork ready. She knew it without calling. Patricia was the kind of attorney who prepared 3 steps ahead on principle. All Charlotte had to do was go to Patricia's office and sign her name and begin the 60-day process that would end the arrangement as cleanly as it had begun. She had told Roman it would happen today. She had told him while she still had clarity. She was still clear. She was just also very tired and standing on a sidewalk in Lower Manhattan in the middle of a Tuesday in March. And the exit clause could be signed at Patricia's office in the next 3 hours, or it could be signed tomorrow, and either way, the clock started when the ink dried. She walked, no destination. Just the specific therapy of movement in a city that didn't require anything from her except the ability to stay out of traffic. She walked north. She walked for a long time. She ended up in the park on a bench near the reservoir, which was not something she'd consciously aimed for, but which her body had apparently decided was the destination. She sat down. The water was gray and flat, and the trees were just starting to think about spring, a few early suggestions of green in the branches overhead. She thought about the months in the apartment, the coffee maker position, the books on the table, the couch where he'd sat at the other end without requiring anything. The morning she'd come into the kitchen in her coat, and he'd read the entire situation in 2 seconds and produced warmth without ceremony. She thought about the corridor in the Meridian, the maintenance cloth, the specific quality of being seen by someone who had no investment in her performance. She thought about what he'd said in the document room when she'd found the folder in Hess's archive, the way his face had changed, not slowly, the thing that surfaced when the control stepped aside. She thought about standing at the head of a conference table at 9 in the morning, running on no sleep with her professional credentials and 5 months of proximity to a man's life she hadn't fully understood, and taking apart 4 years of carefully constructed fraud in front of 12 people who had every reason to dismiss her. She thought about what it had cost. And she thought about what was on the other side of the exit clause, which was an apartment she could now afford because the debts were cleared, and a foundation that would continue because the funding had been established, and a professional reputation that had just been tested in the most extreme context she was likely to encounter, and a mother who would make soup on the weekend, and a life that was hers again, completely, with no contract and no arrangement and no quiet man who cooked with garlic and wine. She sat by the reservoir for a long time. Then she went to see Roman. He was at the apartment. She'd known he would be, in the way she'd learned to know things about him without being told. He answered the door and he looked at her, really looked, the way he'd been doing since the document room, like something had been adjusted and would not go back to its original setting, and he stepped aside without speaking. She came in. She took off her coat, hung it on the hook. She sat at the kitchen table. He sat across from her. Between them, the ordinary afternoon light of the apartment, the coffee maker she'd positioned on the counter, the particular silence they'd developed across 5 months of careful proximity. "Thomas," she said, "I spoke with him this morning, after I spoke with you. And," he made a calculation, "he believes submitting the documentation federally before the council session would eliminate Marco's faction more permanently than an internal vote alone. He was right that it would. He was wrong to do it without your knowledge." A pause. "I've ended his employment with the organization." Charlotte looked at the table. That's not what I'm asking. I know. Did you know he might do it? Roman was quiet for a moment. I knew Thomas operated on specific principles. I should have anticipated how he'd apply them in this specific circumstance. I did not. He met her eyes. I am responsible for what the people around me do. I've always known that. I failed to protect you from the consequences of my own organization, and I can't put that anywhere except exactly where it belongs. She nodded. The federal unit, she said, Okafor's people. They're moving on Marco and Hess. I know. My attorney has been in contact. The internal counsel proceedings. Suspended pending the external investigation. Alderman is managing the interim structure. He's not warm about it, but he's competent and he respects the charter. A pause. The organization will survive. The legitimate infrastructure is intact. The criminal elements that Hess and Marco maintained will be exposed through the federal process. It's going to be a long 18 months. But you'll come out of it. The organization will come out of it. What I come out of it with is, he paused, less certain. She looked at him. What do you mean? He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him make the decision she'd come to recognize. Not what to say, but how much. The council review, he said. When the federal investigation concludes and the charter review completes, there will be a legitimate vote on leadership. And I've been thinking about what Benedetti said in the session this morning when he switched his vote. He pulled me aside while you were speaking with Alderman, and he said, Roman stopped. What did he say? He said that he'd voted against me 4 years ago because he believed I would dismantle the organization. And he said that watching what I'd built and protected over 4 years of cover and watching what I'd chosen to bring into my life, he paused, and the pause had weight, had changed his understanding of what I was trying to protect. Charlotte was very still. He meant you, Roman said. In part, he meant that a man who chose the way I chose, who looked for honesty in a hotel corridor and built something careful and real around it, was not the same as a man who would burn what 3 generations built for ideology. He looked at his hands. He was wrong about what I was trying to protect. Or, not wrong, incomplete. What were you trying to protect? At the beginning? The organization, the legitimate infrastructure, the people inside it who weren't complicit in the rest. He looked up. And then something else, over 5 months, something that had nothing to do with strategy or council votes or the case I was building. She held his gaze. Roman, she said, I walked in here today to tell you I'm not signing the exit clause yet. He went very still. Not because the arrangement is working, she said carefully. It's not. The arrangement was built on incomplete information, and it served purposes that I wasn't fully aware of, and it cannot continue as it was. She kept her eyes on his. But I'm also not going to pretend that 5 months of proximity to a person means nothing just because the structure around it was flawed. I'm not built that way. He didn't speak. What I want, she said, is to stop. The arrangement, the contract, the specific construction of what we've been doing. I want it stopped, and I want to start something else. Something that isn't based on what either of us needed 6 months ago. She looked at the table. I don't know if that's possible. I don't know if you're capable of a relationship that doesn't have strategic dimensions. I don't know if I can trust the version of you I've been living with, knowing now how much was managed. She looked back up. But I want to find out, if you do. Roman was quiet for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. The light moved slightly across the counter. I don't know if I'm capable of it either, he said finally. I have spent my entire adult life in a context where every relationship had weight and every choice had consequence, and showing a person who you actually were was a vulnerability you couldn't afford. He paused. And then you sat in my corridor and cried without performing it, and something... He stopped, tried again. Something that had been very quiet for a very long time got louder. She looked at him. I'm not forgiving everything, she said. I know. The deception, Thomas. The way I was used, even if you didn't design it, I'm not... That doesn't disappear. No, he said, it doesn't. And there are things about your life I don't know if I can live adjacent to. The organization, whatever it becomes after the investigation. I need to understand what I'm actually near, fully, not the managed version. Yes, he said, you deserve that. I'm going to go to my mother's this weekend, she said. I need to be somewhere that has nothing to do with any of this for 2 days. And when I come back, I want to have a conversation, a real one, not a briefing, about what your life actually is and what you actually want from it. And then we decide if there's something here worth building. Roman looked at her with the expression she'd cataloged across 5 months and had never quite been able to fully read until this moment. The stillness, the control, and beneath both of those things, the specific quality of a man who had spent years in proximity to power and betrayal and had never once, in any of it, found what he was looking for until a hotel corridor in October. All right, he said. She nodded. She stood up. He stood with her. She picked up her coat and she put it on, and she was almost at the door when she turned around, because there was one more thing, and she had been carrying it since the document room, and it was not the kind of thing she was capable of leaving unsaid. The foundation, she said, my father's foundation. They used his death. They found a real grief, and they pushed it and used it as a mechanism to manufacture my availability. She held Roman's gaze. I want you to know that what I did in that conference room this morning, the case I built, the vote I moved, none of that was for the organization. None of it was for the marriage or the arrangement or anything between us. She paused. It was for him, for what he built and why he built it. She paused again. I needed you to know that. Roman was very still. I know, he said quietly. I knew when I watched you work. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she opened the door and walked out into the hallway, and she took the elevator down, and she walked out of the building into the March afternoon. The weekend was soup and her mother's kitchen and the particular sound of a house she'd grown up in. The creak of the third stair, the specific quality of the light through the east window in the morning, the way the neighborhood smelled different from the city. Her mother asked careful questions, and Charlotte answered the ones she could and deflected the ones she couldn't, and they watched television in the evenings, and it was ordinary and restorative in the way that only very familiar things could be restorative. She visited her father's grave on Saturday morning, alone, early, before the cemetery filled with the weekend visitors. She stood in the cold with her hands in her pockets, and she talked to him the way she'd talked to him in her head since October, about the foundation, about the debt, about the year that had felt like a slow collapse and turned out to be something being pulled apart from the outside. She told him about the conference room, about 38 minutes and 9 votes, and a fraud case that was now in the hands of people whose job it was to finish it. She told him it was going to be okay. She wasn't sure if she was telling him or herself, and decided it didn't matter. On Sunday afternoon, she drove back to the city. She went to Patricia's office first. The exit clause, Patricia said, when Charlotte sat down. I'm amending it, Charlotte said. I want to restructure the arrangement as a pause, not a termination, a renegotiation. Everything else in the contract remains valid, but the marriage continues on a month-to-month basis pending the establishment of... She paused, looking for the right word. Patricia looked at her over her reading glasses. Something voluntary? Yes, Charlotte said. Something voluntary. Patricia made a note. This is a non-standard amendment. I know. It essentially converts a contract arrangement into a... I know what it converts it into, Patricia. Patricia looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote the amendment. Spring arrived in the unannounced way it arrived in New York. Not gradually, but in a single day when the quality of the light changed and the air lost its edge and the city remembered that it was capable of softness. Charlotte noticed it on a Tuesday morning in April when she walked to the subway and the trees on the block were suddenly doing something, small and green and committed. The federal investigation proceeded at federal pace, which was to say it was thorough and slow and occasionally maddening and entirely outside Charlotte's control, which she had made a deliberate practice of accepting. She cooperated completely. She answered every question. She provided supplementary documentation 3 times when the investigative team needed clarification on specific elements of the fraud structure. Okafor called her in May with an update. Marco Moretti and Calvin Hess were indicted this morning, she said. 12 counts between them. Enzo Moretti and the fourth party, Driscoll, have agreed to cooperation agreements. Charlotte was at her desk at Hargrove and Associates when the call came. She set down her coffee. The foundation, she said. The wire fraud charges related to the coordinated donor withdrawal campaign are included. Your family's foundation will be named in the civil remedy proceedings. The legal team will be in touch about restitution options. She sat with that. Thank you, Agent Okafor. Thank you, Miss Whitmore. The work you did in 13 hours. Okafor paused, in the way that someone paused when they were about to say something and were deciding whether to say it. We have forensic accountants on staff with 20 years of experience. What you built in that time frame was exceptional. If you're ever interested in a different professional context, I'll keep that in mind, Charlotte said. She hung up. She sat at her desk for a moment. Then she called her mother. Then she called Roman. He picked up on the second ring. Indicted, she said. A pause. I heard. How do you feel? Another pause, longer. Like something that's been pressing for 4 years has stopped pressing. A pause. And like that's not the most important thing that happened today. She thought about that. What's the most important thing? The most important thing, he said, is that you called me. She looked out her office window at the April street below. I'm coming home at 6, she said. Don't make anything complicated. I'm tired. Pasta, he said. Half an hour. Fine. She went back to work. 6 months later, in the gold-edged corridor of the Meridian Grand Hotel on a Thursday evening, Charlotte Whitmore stood at a particular stretch of marble wall and looked at what had been mounted there. Roman stood beside her. The plaque was small, bronze, the kind that required a certain proximity to read. She had known it was coming, had been told by Thomas's replacement, a composed young woman named Vera, that Roman had arranged it, but she hadn't expected the specific simplicity of it. No declaration, no sentiment performed for an audience, just 7 words. The place where an honest woman stood. She stood in front of it for a long time. Around them, the hotel moved in its Thursday evening rhythm. The distant sound of the event floor, the murmur of the lobby bar, the particular quality of a space that absorbed thousands of private moments daily and kept none of them. Honest woman, she said. Yes. Not the obvious choice for a plaque. The obvious choice would have been wrong, he said. She looked at him. He was wearing a jacket she'd watched him put on 40 minutes ago in the apartment, and his hair had grown out slightly from the winter, and his eyes were that particular color she had spent a year trying to categorize and had finally stopped trying and simply accepted as the color they were. I want to tell you something, she said. All right, the night we met, when you handed me that cloth and called Bradley an idiot. She looked back at the plaque. I thought you were kind, and then I thought you were complicated, and then I thought you'd used me, and then I thought... She paused. I went through a lot of versions of what I thought about you. I know. The version I've landed on, she said, is that you're a person who made choices I don't agree with, and who paid costs for them, and who was genuinely trying to find something real inside a life that had very few real things in it. She looked at him. And that you found it in the wrong way, in the right place at the same time. Roman was quiet. The corridor was quiet. I'm not the same person I was when I stood here in October, she said. No, he agreed. Neither am I. She looked at the plaque one more time. The bronze was new and slightly bright, catching the corridor light. She thought about her father, about the foundation, which had reopened its donor relationships across the spring and was currently running its first new program in 14 months, a medical debt navigation service for families in 3 boroughs, staffed by 2 people Charlotte had helped hire. She thought about her mother, who had retired from the cafeteria shift in August, when the debt restitution proceedings began to deliver results, who was learning to paint badly and happily in the back bedroom. She thought about Patricia Eng, who had converted the contract amendment without comment, and with the specific efficiency of a woman who understood that some legal documents were, underneath their architecture, just people trying to find their footing. She thought about standing at the head of a conference table at 9 in the morning and pulling a thread until something came apart that had been held together with fraud for 4 years. She thought about what her father had said near the end. The worst kind of pride is the kind that lets people you love suffer rather than ask for help. She had asked for help, not cleanly, not from a source she'd fully understood, but she had asked and something had answered, and the answer had been more complicated than anything she would have chosen and more real than anything she had expected. Roman took her hand. His hand was warm and steady, The same as it had been in the courthouse on a Thursday morning a year ago, when 11 minutes had changed everything. She looked down at their joined hands for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "Pasta's going to take half an hour," she said. "We have time." She nodded. They stood in the corridor where everything had started. Not a beginning they would have designed, not a story they would have chosen, but the one they'd gotten and survived and built something inside of that had cost enough to be worth keeping. The chandelier above the ballroom entrance threw light into the corridor in gold pieces. Charlotte held Roman's hand and let herself stand still, in the place where she'd once pressed her back against cold marble and tried to remember how to breathe, and she felt the distance between that woman and this one, not as loss, but as the specific weight of everything it had taken to cross it. She squeezed his hand once. He squeezed back. They walked away from the plaque together, back through the corridor and into the evening, and the hotel absorbed them the way it absorbed everything, without ceremony, without comment, and the city received them on the other side of its glass doors and moved around them with its usual magnificent indifference, and neither of them looked back.